The earliest copper artifacts discovered by archaeologists tell a story that begins not in grand workshops or bustling marketplaces, but in the quiet moments when ancient craftsmen first noticed the peculiar green-tinged stones scattered across the Anatolian highlands. These native copper nuggets, weathered from their original veins by millennia of geological processes, caught the attention of toolmakers who had already mastered the art of knapping flint and shaping obsidian. Unlike the brittle fracture patterns of stone, copper responded differently to percussion. It deformed rather than shattered, creating possibilities that would fundamentally alter human technological development. The earliest evidence of copper working appears in the archaeological record around 5500 BC at sites across Anatolia and the Balkans. At Kayonu Tepesi in southeastern Turkey, archaeologists uncovered copper beads, pins, and small tools that show clear signs of cold hammering techniques. The craftsmen who created these objects discovered that repeated striking with stone hammers could flatten and shape copper without the need for heat, though the metal would become brittle and require annealing, a process they would later master through careful observation of how fire affected the material's properties. These early copper workers operated within communities that were already experiencing significant social and economic transformations. The site of Çatalhöyük, occupied from approximately 7,100 to 5,700 BC, provides crucial insights into how specialized craft production began to reshape social relationships. The settlement's densely packed mud brick houses, accessed through roof openings rather than ground-level doors, housed families engaged in increasingly diverse economic activities. Archaeological evidence reveals distinct workshop areas where obsidian tools were manufactured, textiles were woven, and eventually copper objects were crafted. The layout of Çatalhöyük itself reflects the changing nature of social organisation during this period. Unlike earlier hunter-gatherer camps where material possessions were typically limited and portable, the houses at Çatalhöyük contained elaborate wall paintings, plastered bull heads with actual horn cores, and increasingly sophisticated burial goods. The presence of specialized copper working tools in certain households suggests that metallurgical knowledge was not equally distributed throughout the community. Specific families or lineages appear to have controlled access to both the raw materials and the technical expertise required for metal production. Environmental pressures played a crucial role in driving these technological innovations. The period between 5,500 and 4,500 BC witnessed significant climate fluctuations that affected both agricultural productivity and resource availability. Paleoclimatic data from lake sediments and ice cores indicates that temperatures dropped noticeably around 5,200 BC, creating what climatologists term the 5.2 kilo-year event. This cooling period reduced growing seasons across much of Europe and Western Asia, forcing communities to develop more efficient tools and weapons to maintain their subsistence strategies. The climate-driven stress on agricultural systems created new demands for durable, sharp-edged tools that could process plant materials more effectively than their stone predecessors. Copper awls proved superior to bone needles for leatherworking, while copper knives maintained their edges longer than obsidian blades when cutting fibrous plant materials. These practical advantages, combined with copper's malleability, made metal tools increasingly valuable as communities faced resource constraints. Trade networks expanded dramatically during this period, as communities sought access to copper sources. The metal's geological distribution meant that many settlements had to establish exchange relationships with groups living near copper deposits. Archaeological evidence from sites like Aybunar in Bulgaria, one of Europe's earliest copper mines, shows that mining operations were already underway by 5000 BC. The mine shafts, some extending over 10 meters deep, required coordinated labour and sophisticated planning that suggests organised mining expeditions rather than casual collection of surface deposits. The expansion of trade networks created new forms of social complexity as communities developed systems for managing long-distance exchange relationships. Standardized weights and measures began to appear at sites across the region, indicating that trade had become sufficiently regular to require consistent measurement systems. Copper objects themselves often served as trade goods, with distinctive regional styles suggesting that different communities developed their own metallurgical traditions while maintaining contact with neighbouring groups. The most dramatic evidence of emerging social stratification appears in the archaeological record at Varna, on Bulgaria's Black Sea coast. The Varna necropolis, dating to approximately 4600–4200 BC, contains some of the earliest evidence of systematic wealth accumulation in human history. The cemetery's most famous burial, known as Grave 43, contained the remains of a middle-aged male accompanied by over 990 gold objects totalling more than 1.5 kilograms of precious metal. The burial goods included a gold-hafted copper axe, gold appliques that once decorated clothing, and numerous gold ornaments that would have created a spectacular visual display. The Varna burials reveal a society where access to metal goods had become a primary marker of social status. The cemetery contains clear evidence of social ranking, with some graves containing elaborate assemblages of copper tools, gold ornaments and imported goods, while others held only simple pottery vessels or remained completely unaccompanied. The presence of cenotaphs, symbolic graves containing rich assemblages but no humana remains, suggests that some individuals had achieved such high status that their social position could be commemorated even in their absence. The technological knowledge required to produce the Varna grave goods indicates that metallurgical expertise had advanced significantly by this period. The copper axes found in the richest burials show evidence of both hammering and casting techniques, suggesting that craftsmen had discovered how to melt copper and pour it into moulds. This represented a major technological leap from the earlier cold hammering methods, requiring not only higher temperatures, but also the development of specialized furnaces and mold-making techniques. The gold objects from Varna demonstrate another crucial development: the recognition of precious metals as distinct from utilitarian copper. While copper's value derived primarily from its functional advantages over stone tools, gold's appeal lay in its aesthetic properties and resistance to tarnishing. The elaborate gold diadems, bracelets, and clothing appliques found in the richest graves served no practical function, but created powerful visual symbols of their owner's elevated status. Population pressures contributed to the intensification of metallurgical production during this period. Archaeological surveys indicate that settlement density increased significantly across southeastern Europe and Anatolia between 5,500 and 4,500 BC. Larger populations required more tools for agricultural work, food processing and craft production, creating sustained demand for metal objects. The increased scale of production is evident in the archaeological record through the appearance of larger copper-working installations and greater quantities of metallurgical debris at settlement sites. The social implications of these demographic changes extended beyond simple supply and demand relationships. Larger communities required more complex systems of social organisation, including mechanisms for allocating resources, resolving disputes, and coordinating collective activities. The control of metallurgical production became one avenue through which ambitious individuals could accumulate power and influence within their communities. Evidence from sites like Hamangia in Romania and Karanovo in Bulgaria shows that copper-working communities developed increasingly sophisticated settlement patterns during this period. Houses were arranged around central courtyards, where communal activities, including metalworking, took place. The positioning of workshops near community centres suggests that metallurgical activities had acquired social significance beyond their purely economic functions. The technological innovations of this period extended beyond metallurgy to encompass related crafts and industries. The development of high-temperature furnaces for copper smelting contributed to advances in pottery production, as ceramicists learned to achieve higher firing temperatures and create more durable vessels. The same communities that pioneered copper working often produced distinctive pottery styles that spread through trade networks, creating archaeological horizons that help researchers track cultural connections across vast geographic areas. Regional variations in copper working techniques began to emerge as different communities developed their own approaches to metallurgy. The Balkans became known for sophisticated casting techniques, while Anatolian craftsmen excelled in the production of decorative copper objects with intricate surface treatments. These regional specializations created complementary trade relationships as communities exchanged their distinctive products for goods produced elsewhere. The period's technological developments also influenced military organization and conflict patterns. Copper weapons, while not dramatically superior to their stone counterparts in terms of cutting ability, offered significant advantages in terms of durability and repairability. A damaged copper spear point could be reforged, while a broken obsidian blade required complete replacement. This practical consideration became increasingly important as communities invested more resources in military equipment and needed to maintain their arsenals over extended periods. The technological foundations established during the earliest copper working period created the conditions for unprecedented social experiments in southeastern Europe. Between 4,500 and 4000 BC, the fertile river valleys and coastal plains of the Balkans witnessed the emergence of settlements that dwarfed anything previously seen in prehistoric Europe. These communities represented a dramatic departure from the small-scale villages that had characterized earlier agricultural societies, evolving into complex urban centers that would not be matched in scale until the rise of Bronze Age civilizations centuries later. The Cucuteni Tripilia culture, spanning territories across modern-day Romania, Moldova and Ukraine, achieved population densities that challenged conventional assumptions about prehistoric demographic limits. Archaeological investigations at Talianki, located in central Ukraine, revealed a settlement covering over 335 hectares, with an estimated population of 15,000 inhabitants at its peak around 4100 BC. The site's layout, reconstructed through magnetometer surveys and excavation, shows over 1,600 individual structures arranged in concentric rings around a central plaza. Each ring contained specialized quarters where different craft activities took place, with metallurgy, pottery production, and textile manufacturing occupying distinct sectors of the settlement. The houses themselves reflected the sophisticated planning that characterized these mega-settlements. Built using a distinctive wattle and daub technique with timber frameworks, the structures typically measured 12 meters in length and contained multiple rooms with specialized functions. Ground floors served as workshops and storage areas, while upper levels provided living quarters for extended families. Archaeological evidence indicates that many houses contained purpose-built kilns for pottery firing, suggesting that ceramic production had become a household-level industry rather than a specialized craft practiced by a few individuals. The pottery produced by Cucuteni Tripilia craftsmen represents one of prehistoric Europe's most sophisticated ceramic traditions. The distinctive vessels, characterized by intricate spiral and geometric patterns painted in black and red on cream-colored backgrounds, required multiple firing stages and precise temperature control to achieve their characteristic appearance. The complexity of the decoration suggests that pottery had transcended its purely functional origins to become a medium for artistic expression and cultural identity. Standardized vessel forms found across multiple sites indicate that production followed established patterns, possibly controlled by craft guilds or family workshops that maintained consistent quality standards. The scale of pottery production at these settlements was enormous. Excavations at Nebalivka in Ukraine uncovered pottery kilns capable of firing hundreds of vessels simultaneously, while refuse deposits contain millions of ceramic fragments representing thousands of complete vessels. The sheer quantity of pottery debris suggests that ceramic production had become industrialized to a degree not seen elsewhere in prehistoric Europe. Chemical analysis of clay sources indicates that raw materials were transported from quarries located up to 50 kilometers away, requiring organized procurement systems and possibly specialized transport teams. Concurrent with the fluorescence of the Cucuteni Tripilia settlements, the Black Sea coastal regions witnessed the emergence of the Varna culture, which would achieve metallurgical innovations that surpassed contemporary developments elsewhere in the world. The Varna necropolis, already mentioned for its spectacular grave goods, represents only one component of a broader cultural complex that transformed the Black Sea into Europe's premier centre for precious metalworking. The technical expertise demonstrated in Varna gold objects required not only advanced smelting capabilities, but also sophisticated understanding of alloy composition and metalworking techniques. The gold artifacts from Varna display a level of craftsmanship that indicates generations of accumulated expertise. The famous gold diadem from Grave 4, weighing over 200 grams, consists of multiple components joined using techniques that required precise temperature control and timing. The decorative elements include raised bosses created through repousse work, intricate filigree details, and surface treatments that enhance the metal's natural luster. X-ray fluorescence analysis reveals that the gold contains trace amounts of silver and copper, suggesting that the craftsmen understood how these additives affected the metal's working properties and final appearance. The Varna goldsmiths developed innovative techniques for creating hollow objects that maximized visual impact while conserving precious metal. The gold-hafted axes found in several graves consist of thin gold sheets carefully shaped around wooden cores, creating the appearance of solid gold implements while using relatively modest amounts of raw material. This approach demonstrates not only technical sophistication, but also economic calculation, as the craftsmen balanced aesthetic requirements against material constraints. Beyond the famous cemetery, the broader Varna culture encompassed numerous settlements where everyday metallurgical activities took place. At Dranculac, located on Bulgaria's northern coast, archaeologists uncovered workshops containing crucibles, tuyères, and slag deposits that indicate regular copper and gold processing. The workshop areas were positioned near the settlement's periphery, possibly to minimize fire risks to residential areas, but remained integrated into the community's daily activities rather than being isolated in specialized industrial zones. The expansion of metallurgical expertise across the Balkans created trade networks that connected communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. Copper sources in the Carpathian Mountains supplied raw materials to workshops throughout southeastern Europe, while finished objects moved in the opposite direction, carrying technological innovations and stylistic influences to distant markets. The Ibunar copper mine in Bulgaria expanded its operations significantly during this period, with archaeological evidence indicating that mining shafts reached depths of over 20 meters and required sophisticated timber support systems to prevent collapse. Trade routes extended far beyond the immediate copper-producing regions, connecting Balkan metallurgical centres with communities across the Aegean and Mediterranean. Obsidian from Gyali and Milos continued to flow northward, while Balkan copper objects appeared in contexts as distant as the Po Valley and southern France. The movement of these goods required organised transport systems and established exchange relationships that could guarantee safe passage through multiple territorial boundaries. The social implications of these expanded trade networks were profound. Communities that controlled key routes or resource sources accumulated wealth and influence that translated into political power. At Pietrel in Romania, excavations revealed a settlement where certain households possessed disproportionate quantities of imported goods, including Aegean shells, Carpathian copper, and exotic stone materials from distant sources. The distribution pattern suggests that these families served as intermediaries in long-distance trade, accumulating wealth through their control of exchange relationships. The increasing complexity of trade relationships required new forms of social organisation and record-keeping. While writing systems would not appear in Europe for several millennia, communities developed other methods for tracking obligations and exchange relationships. Standardized weights made from polished stone appear at numerous sites, indicating that trade had become sufficiently regular to require consistent measurement systems. Some scholars argue that the geometric patterns found on Cucuteni Tripelia pottery may have served mnemonic functions, helping traders remember complex exchange agreements or territorial boundaries. Military considerations became increasingly important as communities competed for control over trade routes and resource sources. Fortified settlements appeared across the region, with elaborate defensive systems that required coordinated construction efforts and ongoing maintenance. At Poljanica in Serbia, archaeologists uncovered a hill fort with multiple defensive walls and evidence of violent destruction, suggesting that competition for resources sometimes escalated into open warfare. The site contained numerous copper weapons, including axes and spear points that showed signs of combat damage, indicating that metallurgical innovations were being applied to military technology. The organisation of these large settlements required administrative capabilities that went far beyond the simple, kinship-based systems that governed earlier agricultural communities. At Majdanetska in Ukraine, site layout analysis reveals careful planning that allocated specific areas for different activities while maintaining efficient circulation patterns throughout the settlement. The central plaza areas contained large structures that may have served administrative or ceremonial functions, while residential quarters were organised into neighbourhoods that possibly reflected kinship or occupational groupings. Evidence for emerging social stratification appears throughout the archaeological record of this period. At Gumelnita in Romania, burial practices show clear distinctions between individuals buried with elaborate grave goods and others interred with minimal accompaniments. The richest graves contained not only local copper and gold objects, but also imported materials that demonstrated the deceased's participation in long-distance trade networks. These burial patterns suggest that wealth accumulation had become hereditary, with high-status families maintaining their positions across multiple generations. The technological innovations of this period extended beyond metallurgy to encompass numerous other crafts and industries. Textile production achieved new levels of sophistication, as evidenced by the elaborate loom weights and spindle whorls found at settlement sites throughout the region. Chemical analysis of textile impressions on pottery indicates that flax cultivation had become widespread, providing raw materials for linen production that complemented the wool obtained from domesticated sheep and goats. Agricultural intensification accompanied the growth of large settlements, as increased population densities required more efficient food production systems. Archaeobotanical evidence from Cucuteni Tripelia sites shows diversified crop assemblages that included wheat, barley, millet and legumes, suggesting that farmers had developed rotation systems that maintained soil fertility while maximising yields. The presence of large storage facilities at these settlements indicates that communities were producing significant agricultural surpluses that could support non-food producing specialists. The climatic conditions during this period generally favoured agricultural expansion and population growth. Paleoclimatic reconstructions indicate that temperatures were slightly warmer than modern levels, while precipitation patterns provided adequate moisture for crop cultivation across much of southeastern Europe. These favourable conditions contributed to the demographic expansion that made large settlements possible, but they also created vulnerabilities that would later contribute to the culture's decline. Around 4200 BC, signs of stress began to appear across the Balkan Copper Age societies. At numerous Cucuteni Tripilia settlements, archaeologists have documented episodes of house burning that appear to have been deliberate rather than accidental. The burnt structures were typically abandoned rather than rebuilt, suggesting that these events marked the end of occupation rather than temporary setbacks. The reasons for these burning episodes remain debated, with explanations ranging from ritual practices to defensive measures against approaching enemies. Environmental pressures may have contributed to the destabilization of these complex societies. Paleoclimatic data indicates that the period around 4200 BC witnessed significant climate deterioration across much of Europe and Western Asia. The 4.2 kilo-year event, as climatologists term this period, brought cooler temperatures and reduced precipitation that would have stressed agricultural systems adapted to the previous warmer conditions. Reduced crop yields could have undermined the economic foundations that supported large population concentrations and specialised craft production. The archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing signs of conflicts and social disruption. Fortified settlements became more common, while evidence of violent destruction appears at numerous sites. At Varna itself, the famous cemetery appears to have been abandoned around 4000 BC, with no comparable burials dating to later periods. The disappearance of such spectacular wealth displays suggests that the social systems that had generated extreme inequality may have collapsed or been deliberately dismantled. Resource depletion may have played a role in the decline of Balkan Copper Age societies. The intensive mining operations at sites like Aybunar had extracted large quantities of high-grade ore, and it is possible that the most accessible deposits were becoming exhausted. The need to extract ore from deeper shafts or lower-grade sources would have increased production costs and potentially disrupted the economic relationships that had sustained the metallurgical industry. The demographic collapse that affected many Balkan settlements during this period was dramatic and widespread. Sites that had supported thousands of inhabitants were abandoned, with populations either dispersing to smaller settlements or migrating to entirely different regions. The mega-settlements of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture disappeared completely, leaving behind only archaeological traces of their former grandeur. This demographic transition marked the end of Europe's first experiment with urban-scale communities, and similar population concentrations would not reappear in the region until the Roman period. The collapse of the Balkan mega-settlements around 4000 BC coincided with a remarkable transformation occurring in the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. While European communities grappled with demographic decline and social fragmentation, Mesopotamian societies were embarking on an entirely different trajectory that would establish the world's first true urban centres. The Ubaid period, spanning from approximately 5500 to 3500 BC, witnessed innovations in copperworking, agricultural technology, and social organisation that would fundamentally reshape human civilization and establish patterns that would influence development across the ancient Near East for millennia to come. The earliest Ubaid settlements emerged in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, where communities like Eridu began as modest farming villages but gradually evolved into complex proto-urban centres. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed 18 successive building phases spanning nearly 2 millennia, documenting a continuous process of growth and architectural innovation. The site's earliest levels, dating to around 5400 BC, contained simple reed and mud structures typical of marsh-dwelling communities, but by 4500 BC, the settlement featured substantial mud brick buildings, elaborate temple complexes, and specialised workshop areas where copperworking had become a regular activity. The transformation of Eridu from village to proto-city reflected broader changes in Mesopotamian society that distinguished it from contemporary developments elsewhere. Unlike the Balkan settlements, which appear to have grown rapidly and then collapsed, Mesopotamian communities developed gradually through incremental innovations in technology, social organization, and environmental management. The key to this sustained growth lay in the development of irrigation systems that could harness the annual floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers while providing year-round water access for agriculture and craft production. The irrigation networks that emerged during the Ubaid period represented engineering achievements of unprecedented complexity. At sites like and Uruk, archaeologists have traced canal systems extending dozens of kilometres from the main river channels, complete with distribution gates, settling basins, and drainage channels that prevented soil salinization. The construction of these systems required not only technical expertise, but also sophisticated social organisation, as multiple communities had to coordinate their efforts to maintain shared infrastructure and allocate water rights fairly among different users. The labour requirements for irrigation construction and maintenance created new forms of social organisation that differed markedly from the kinship-based systems that had governed earlier agricultural communities. Work gangs needed to be organised, supervised and provisioned during construction seasons, while ongoing maintenance required permanent administrative structures that could coordinate activities across multiple settlements. Archaeological evidence suggests that temple complexes served as the organisational centres for these activities, with religious authorities taking responsibility for managing the practical aspects of irrigation agriculture. Copperworking evolved significantly within this context of increasing social complexity and technological innovation. The Ubaid period witnessed the establishment of specialised workshops at sites like Eridu, and Tel El Ouaili, where craftsmen developed new techniques for smelting, casting and finishing metal objects. These workshops were typically located near temple complexes, suggesting that metallurgical production had acquired religious significance beyond its purely economic functions. The association between metalworking and religious authority would become a defining characteristic of Mesopotamian civilization, with temples serving as centres for technological innovation and craft specialisation. The copper objects produced in these workshops displayed technical sophistication that surpassed contemporary work elsewhere in the Near East. Excavations at have yielded copper axes, chisels and ornamental objects that show evidence of advanced casting techniques, including the use of complex moulds that could produce objects with intricate surface details. The craftsmen had mastered the art of controlling metal composition, creating bronze-like alloys by adding arsenic or tin to copper, which produced harder and more durable tools than pure copper alone. The workshop areas at these sites reveal the scale and organisation of Ubaid metallurgical production. At Tel Es Sawan in central Mesopotamia, archaeologists uncovered a copper working installation that included multiple furnaces, extensive slag deposits, and hundreds of finished and partially completed objects. The workshop's layout suggests that production followed standardized procedures, with different areas designated for specific stages of the manufacturing process. Raw materials were processed in one sector, while casting, finishing and quality control took place in adjacent areas under the supervision of master craftsmen. The demand for copper objects during the Ubaid period extended far beyond utilitarian tools to encompass a wide range of decorative and ceremonial items. Temple inventories, reconstructed from later cuneiform texts but likely reflecting earlier practices, included copper vessels, figurines, and architectural elements that served religious functions. The famous copper relief from the Ubaid temple at dating to around 3500 BC, depicts a lion-headed eagle grasping two stags, demonstrating the sophisticated artistic capabilities that Mesopotamian metalworkers had achieved by the end of this period. The expansion of copper working created new demands for raw materials that could not be satisfied by local sources. Mesopotamia's alluvial plains contained no metal deposits, forcing communities to establish trade relationships with copper-producing regions in Anatolia, the Zagros Mountains, and the Arabian Peninsula. These trade networks became increasingly complex during the Ubaid period, with archaeological evidence indicating regular contact between Mesopotamian settlements and communities hundreds of kilometers away. The Ubaid expansion, as archaeologists term the spread of Mesopotamian cultural influences during this period, extended across much of the northern Persian Gulf region and into the Zagros foothills. Sites like Tepe Gara in northern Iraq and Susa in southwestern Iran show clear evidence of Mesopotamian influence in their pottery styles, architectural techniques, and metallurgical practices. This cultural expansion appears to have been driven primarily by trade relationships rather than military conquest, as communities adopted Mesopotamian innovations while maintaining their own distinct cultural identities. The organisation of long-distance trade required administrative capabilities that pushed Mesopotamian societies toward increasingly complex forms of social organisation. Archaeological evidence suggests that temple authorities took responsibility for managing trade relationships, using their religious authority to guarantee the honesty of transactions and the quality of goods. The development of standardized weights and measures during this period reflects the need for consistent systems that could facilitate exchange relationships across cultural boundaries. Competition for control over trade routes and copper sources led to the first clear evidence of organized warfare in Mesopotamian history. The site of Tel Es Sawan, strategically located on the Tigris River north of Baghdad, was surrounded by a massive defensive wall during the late Ubaid period, complete with towers and gates that could control access to the settlement. The wall's construction required enormous labour investment, and suggests that the community faced significant military threats from rival groups seeking to control river traffic and trade routes. Similar fortifications appeared at other strategic locations throughout Mesopotamia during this period, indicating that warfare had become a regular feature of inter-community relations. At Tepe Gara, archaeologists uncovered evidence of violent destruction followed by rapid rebuilding, suggesting that the settlement experienced repeated attacks but possessed sufficient resources to recover from military setbacks. The presence of copper weapons, including spear points, axes and mace heads, in destruction layers indicates that metallurgical innovations were being applied to military technology. The evidence for organised warfare during the Ubaid period includes not only fortifications and weapons, but also changes in settlement patterns that reflect security concerns. Many communities relocated to defensible positions on elevated ground, or constructed their buildings in compact arrangements that could be more easily defended. The famous Eye Temple at Tel Brak in northern Syria, dating to the late Ubaid period, was surrounded by a massive wall that enclosed not only religious buildings, but also workshops, storage facilities, and residential areas, creating a fortified complex that could withstand extended sieges. The temple complexes that emerged during the Ubaid period served as much more than religious centres, functioning as integrated economic and administrative institutions that coordinated multiple aspects of community life. The temple at Eridu, rebuilt and expanded numerous times during the Ubaid period, eventually covered over 1,000 square metres and included not only religious spaces but also workshops, storage rooms, and administrative offices where temple personnel managed agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and trade relationships. The economic role of temples extended to the management of metallurgical production, with temple authorities controlling access to raw materials, supervising workshop activities, and distributing finished products according to community needs and religious requirements. Copper objects found in temple contexts include not only ritual implements, but also tools and weapons that were apparently manufactured under temple supervision and distributed to community members for specific purposes. The administrative capabilities of temple institutions during the Ubaid period laid the groundwork for the development of writing systems that would emerge in later periods. While true writing had not yet appeared, archaeological evidence suggests that temple personnel used various recording systems to track production, distribution, and trade activities. Clay tokens found at Ubaid sites may have served as counting devices or record-keeping tools, while cylinder seals began to appear as methods for marking ownership and authenticating transactions. The social stratification that characterized Ubaid society is clearly visible in burial practices that show marked differences in wealth and status between different individuals and families. At cemetery excavations have revealed graves ranging from simple interments with minimal grave goods to elaborate burials containing dozens of copper objects, imported materials, and other luxury items. The richest graves often contained copper vessels, weapons, and ornaments that would have required significant resources to acquire, suggesting that some families had achieved substantial wealth through their control of trade relationships or craft production. The emergence of social elites during the Ubaid period created new demands for prestige goods that could display wealth and status. Copper objects played crucial roles in these display systems, with elaborate vessels, weapons, and ornaments serving as symbols of their owners' elevated positions within community hierarchies. The technical sophistication required to produce these objects meant that metallurgical expertise itself became a source of social power, with master craftsmen achieving high status within their communities. The agricultural innovations that supported Ubaid population growth and social complexity included not only irrigation technology, but also improvements in crop varieties and farming techniques. Archaeobotanical evidence indicates that Mesopotamian farmers had developed sophisticated understanding of soil management, crop rotation, and selective breeding that allowed them to achieve yields far exceeding those possible with earlier farming methods. The agricultural surplus generated by these innovations provided the economic foundation that supported specialized craft production and long-distance trade. The scale of agricultural production during the Ubaid period is evident in the massive storage facilities that appeared at major settlements. At Uruk, archaeologists have uncovered granaries capable of storing thousands of tons of grain, while administrative texts from later periods suggest that temple institutions managed agricultural production on an industrial scale. The ability to accumulate and redistribute agricultural surplus gave temple authorities enormous economic power that they used to support craft specialists, maintain trade relationships, and fund construction projects. The environmental management required for sustained irrigation agriculture created new forms of technical expertise that influenced other aspects of Mesopotamian technology. The engineering skills developed for canal construction were applied to urban planning, with settlements featuring carefully planned drainage systems, street layouts, and building foundations that could withstand the challenges of construction on alluvial soils. These technical innovations contributed to the development of true urban centres that could support populations numbering in the tens of thousands. By the end of the Ubaid period, around 3500 BC, Mesopotamian communities had established the technological, social, and economic foundations that would support the emergence of the world's first urban civilizations. The innovations in copperworking, irrigation technology, and social organization that characterized this period created new possibilities for human achievement that would be realized in the subsequent Uruk period, when Mesopotamian cities would grow to unprecedented size and complexity, establishing patterns of urban life that would influence human development for millennia to come. The technological and social innovations that had transformed Mesopotamian society during the Ubaid period created ripple effects that extended far beyond the alluvial plains of the Tigris and Euphrates. As Mesopotamian cities consolidated their control over regional trade networks and developed increasingly sophisticated metallurgical techniques, communities across Anatolia found themselves positioned at the intersection of expanding commercial relationships that would fundamentally reshape the ancient world. The strategic location of Anatolia, bridging Europe and Asia while controlling access between the Black Sea and Mediterranean basins, made its settlements crucial intermediaries in the copper trade that was becoming the backbone of interregional exchange. The site of Troy, perched on a limestone ridge overlooking the Dardanelles Strait, emerged during this period as one of Anatolia's most significant commercial centres. The earliest levels of Troy III, dating to approximately 3500 BC, reveal a fortified settlement covering roughly 9,000 square metres, protected by massive stone walls that incorporated sophisticated architectural techniques borrowed from both European and Near Eastern traditions. The settlement's builders constructed these fortifications using carefully fitted limestone blocks weighing several tons each, requiring coordinated labour efforts and engineering expertise that reflected the community's growing wealth and strategic importance. The houses within Troy demonstrate the prosperity that maritime commerce was bringing to Anatolian communities. Unlike the simple rectangular structures that characterized most contemporary settlements, Trojan buildings featured complex multi-room layouts with stone foundations supporting timber-framed upper stories. Archaeological excavations have revealed hearths equipped with sophisticated ventilation systems, storage areas designed for bulk commodities, and workshop spaces where copper objects were manufactured using techniques that combined local traditions with innovations imported from distant regions. The metallurgical workshops at Troy the Firm produced objects that display remarkable technical sophistication, including copper axes with complex hafting systems, ornamental pins with intricate decorative elements, and vessels that required advanced understanding of metal flow and cooling rates. Chemical analysis of copper artifacts from the site indicates that Trojan craftsmen were working with ores from multiple sources, including deposits in the Taurus Mountains to the south and the Pontic Ranges to the northeast. This diversity of raw materials suggests that Troy had established trade relationships spanning hundreds of kilometres, positioning the settlement as a hub for redistributing metals throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The strategic importance of Troy's location became increasingly apparent as maritime technology advanced during this period. The Dardanelles Strait, barely 1.5 kilometres wide at its narrowest point, created a natural bottleneck where communities could control shipping traffic between the Aegean and Black Seas. Archaeological evidence indicates that Troy I possessed harbour facilities capable of accommodating the wooden vessels that were becoming the primary means of long-distance transport across the eastern Mediterranean. These ships, reconstructed from fragmentary remains found at coastal sites throughout the region, typically measured 20 metres in length and featured shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate both open waters and river systems. The development of these maritime capabilities required innovations that extended far beyond simple boat construction. Navigational techniques had to be developed that could guide vessels across open water without modern instruments, relying instead on careful observation of celestial movements, wind patterns, and coastal landmarks. Archaeological evidence from sites like Polyochni on Lemnos and Thermae on Lesbos suggests that coastal communities were establishing networks of signal fires and landmark structures that could guide navigators through dangerous passages during both day and night conditions. The expansion of maritime trade created new demands for harbour infrastructure that transformed coastal settlements throughout the region. At Liman Tepe on the Turkish coast, archaeologists have uncovered stone-built quays and breakwater systems dating to this period, complete with mooring posts and storage facilities designed for handling bulk cargoes. The construction of these installations required engineering expertise that combined knowledge of local tidal patterns with understanding of stoneworking techniques derived from both architectural and metallurgical traditions. The prosperity generated by maritime commerce attracted the attention of communities throughout Anatolia, leading to the establishment of numerous settlements positioned to take advantage of expanding trade opportunities. At Beysa Sultan in southwestern Anatolia, excavations have revealed a substantial settlement that emerged around 3200 BC, featuring defensive walls, large storage buildings, and workshop areas where copper objects were produced for export to coastal markets. The site's pottery assemblages include vessels clearly designed for transport and storage, with standardized capacities that suggest the development of systematic trading relationships. The most spectacular evidence of Anatolian prosperity during this period comes from the Arslan Tepe complex in eastern Turkey, where archaeological investigations have revealed one of the ancient world's earliest examples of monumental architecture associated with centralized political authority. The site's main building, constructed around 3350 BC, covered over 1,000 square meters and featured elaborate decorative elements including wall paintings, carved stone reliefs, and architectural details that required skilled craftsmen working under centralized direction. The Arslan Tepe complex represents a fundamental transformation in Anatolian social organization, marking the transition from kinship-based communities to hierarchical societies capable of mobilizing large-scale labor forces for construction projects. The building's layout included administrative areas equipped with clay seal impressions and standardized storage vessels, suggesting that the site's rulers had developed bureaucratic systems for managing economic activities across their territories. These administrative innovations parallel developments occurring in Mesopotamian cities, but adapted to local conditions and cultural preferences. The evidence for centralized control at Arslan Tepe extends beyond architecture to encompass the management of metallurgical production on an unprecedented scale. Workshop areas within the complex contained furnaces capable of processing large quantities of copper ore, along with molds for producing standardized tool types that could be distributed throughout the region. Chemical analysis of slag deposits indicates that the site's metalworkers were processing ores from multiple sources simultaneously, creating alloys with specific properties tailored for different applications. The administrative systems that emerged at Arslan Tepe included sophisticated methods for tracking production and distribution activities. Clay ceilings found throughout the complex bear impressions from cylinder seals depicting various animals, geometric patterns, and human figures that may have identified specific administrators or production units. The standardization of these sealing systems suggests that Arslan Tepe's rulers had developed bureaucratic procedures that could manage complex economic relationships across extended territories. The concentration of wealth and power at sites like Arslan Tepe created new forms of social stratification that are clearly visible in the archaeological record. Elite burials from this period contain assemblages of copper objects, imported materials, and luxury goods that demonstrate the enormous resources that successful leaders could accumulate. At Alaka Hoyuk, north of Ankara, royal tombs dating to around 2500 BC contained copper and bronze vessels, weapons decorated with precious metals, and ceremonial standards that would have served as symbols of political authority during public ceremonies. The weapons found in these elite contexts reveal the military dimensions of emerging political competition in Anatolia. Copper and bronze axes, maces, and spear points show evidence of actual combat use, while their elaborate decorative elements suggest that they also served ceremonial functions during peacetime. The standardization of weapon types across multiple sites indicates that Anatolian communities were developing common military technologies, possibly through shared training traditions or alliance relationships. The expansion of Anatolian political entities led to increasing competition for control over trade routes and resource sources, creating conflicts that are documented in destruction layers at numerous sites throughout the region. At Kultepe, excavations have revealed evidence of violent destruction around 2700 BC, followed by rebuilding that incorporated stronger defensive features and different architectural styles. The destruction debris contained numerous copper weapons and arrowheads, suggesting that the site had been captured through military assault rather than abandoned voluntarily. Similar destruction episodes appear at sites throughout Anatolia during this period, creating a pattern of conflict and reconstruction that reflects the competitive dynamics of emerging state systems. At Kanesh, one of Anatolia's most important commercial centres, multiple destruction levels document repeated episodes of warfare that disrupted trade activities, but never completely eliminated the site's commercial importance. The resilience of these trading centres demonstrates the economic value of maintaining commercial relationships, even during periods of political instability. The diplomatic relationships that developed between Anatolian polities created new forms of interregional cooperation that complemented the competitive dynamics of trade and warfare. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities established formal alliance systems that could provide mutual support during military crises while facilitating commercial relationships during peacetime. Standardized pottery styles and metallurgical techniques that appear simultaneously at distant sites may reflect these diplomatic connections, as allied communities shared technological innovations and cultural practices. The influence of Anatolian commercial networks extended far beyond the immediate region, connecting communities across the eastern Mediterranean with resource sources and markets in both Europe and the Near East. Copper objects produced in Anatolian workshops have been found at sites throughout the Aegean, while Mesopotamian cylinder seals appear in Anatolian contexts, demonstrating the extensive reach of these trade relationships. The movement of these goods required sophisticated logistical capabilities that could coordinate shipping schedules, manage currency exchanges, and resolve disputes between merchants from different cultural backgrounds. The technological innovations that supported this expansion of trade included developments in metallurgy that produced increasingly sophisticated copper alloys. Anatolian craftsmen discovered that adding specific amounts of arsenic, tin, or antimony to copper could create metals with enhanced hardness, corrosion resistance, or working properties. These innovations required careful experimentation with ore sources and smelting techniques, suggesting that metallurgical knowledge was becoming increasingly specialized and closely guarded by master craftsmen. The social implications of these technological advances extended beyond simple improvements in tool quality to encompass fundamental changes in economic relationships and political power. Communities that controlled access to advanced metallurgical techniques could produce superior weapons and tools, giving them significant advantages in both military conflicts and commercial competition. The concentration of technical expertise at major centres like Aslan-Tepe and Troy created dependencies that smaller communities had to navigate carefully to maintain their access to essential metal goods. The environmental challenges that affected Anatolian communities during this period included both natural disasters and human-induced changes that influenced settlement patterns and economic activities. Volcanic eruptions in central Anatolia deposited ash layers that are visible in archaeological contexts, while climate fluctuations affected agricultural productivity and water availability. These environmental pressures contributed to the competitive dynamics that characterized the period, as communities competed for access to the most productive agricultural areas and reliable water sources. The population growth that accompanied economic prosperity created new pressures on agricultural systems that required innovative solutions. Archaeological evidence indicates that Anatolian communities developed terracing systems, irrigation networks, and intensive cultivation techniques that could support larger populations than had been possible with earlier farming methods. These agricultural innovations required coordinated labour efforts and technical expertise that paralleled the organisational capabilities being developed for metallurgical production and long-distance trade. The cultural exchanges that resulted from expanded trade relationships introduced new artistic traditions, religious practices, and technological innovations that transformed Anatolian society. pottery styles, architectural techniques, and decorative motifs that originated in distant regions were adapted to local preferences and conditions, creating hybrid cultural forms that reflected the cosmopolitan character of major trading centres. These cultural innovations contributed to the development of distinctive Anatolian identities that would influence the region's development for centuries to come. While Anatolian trading centres flourished as intermediaries in the expanding Mediterranean copper networks, the communities along the Nile River were developing their own distinctive approaches to metallurgy and social organisation that would ultimately surpass their contemporaries in both scale and sophistication. The pre-dynastic period in Egypt, spanning roughly from 4000 to 3100 BC, witnessed transformations that parallel developments elsewhere in the ancient world, while following uniquely Egyptian trajectories shaped by the river valley's distinctive geography, climate, and resource distribution. The earliest evidence of systematic copper exploitation in Egypt appears in the archaeological record around 3800 BC, when communities in Upper Egypt began organising expeditions to the eastern desert's copper deposits. These mining ventures represented a dramatic departure from the opportunistic collection of surface ores that had characterised earlier metallurgical activities. At Timna, located in what is now southern Israel, but then within Egypt's sphere of influence, archaeologists have uncovered extensive mining installations featuring deep shafts, ore processing areas, and temporary settlements that housed hundreds of workers during active mining seasons. The organisation of these mining expeditions required administrative capabilities that went far beyond anything previously seen in Egyptian society. Inscriptions from later periods describe the logistical challenges involved in transporting work crews, tools, food supplies, and water across the desert to remote mining locations, then returning with processed ore and finished copper objects. The scale of these operations suggests that pre-dynastic Egyptian communities had developed sophisticated planning systems that could coordinate activities across vast distances and extended time periods. The copper deposits of the eastern desert presented both opportunities and challenges that shaped Egyptian metallurgical development. Unlike the easily accessible surface deposits that had supplied earlier copper-working communities, the Egyptian sources required deep excavation through hard rock formations. Mining crews used fire-setting techniques, heating rock faces with wood fires, then quenching them with water to create fractures that could be exploited with copper and stone tools. The debris piles at these sites contained thousands of broken hammerstones, copper picks, and wooden tool handles that document the enormous labour investment required for ore extraction. The processing of copper ore at these remote locations required the transport of fuel, flux materials, and technical expertise across hundreds of kilometres of desert terrain. Archaeological excavations at mining sites have revealed sophisticated smelting installations with multiple furnaces, bellows systems, and slag disposal areas that indicate continuous operation over extended periods. The furnaces themselves were constructed using local stone and clay, but their designs incorporated technical innovations that maximised heat retention and ore reduction efficiency. The limited copper sources available in the Sinai Peninsula provided additional challenges and opportunities for Egyptian metallurgists. The deposits at Serabit el Kadim and other Sinai locations contained high-quality ores, but their remote locations and harsh environmental conditions made exploitation extremely difficult. Egyptian mining expeditions to these areas required careful coordination with local Bedouin populations who controlled water sources and transportation routes. Archaeological evidence suggests that these relationships evolved from simple commercial exchanges to more complex arrangements that granted Egyptian authorities semi-permanent access to mining territories. The copper objects produced using ores from these distant sources display technical sophistication that reflects both the quality of raw materials and the expertise of Egyptian craftsmen. Tools and weapons found at pre-dynastic sites show evidence of advanced alloying techniques, with copper being combined with arsenic, antimony, and eventually tin to create metals with enhanced hardness and durability. The consistency of these alloy compositions across different sites suggests that Egyptian metallurgists had developed standardized procedures for ore processing and metal production. The role of copper tools in Egyptian construction projects became increasingly important as communities undertook more ambitious architectural endeavours. The mastaba tombs that emerged during the Gurzean period required precision cutting of stone blocks, excavation of underground chambers, and installation of heavy architectural elements that would have been impossible without metal tools. At Hierakonpolis, excavations of elite tombs have revealed copper chisels, saws, and drilling equipment that show clear signs of use in stoneworking activities. The technological foundations established during these early construction projects would prove crucial for later pyramid construction, though the pre-dynastic period saw only the initial development of these capabilities. The precision required for fitting stone blocks in mastaba construction demanded tools that could maintain sharp edges through extended use, while providing the leverage necessary for working hard stone materials. Copper tools met these requirements in ways that their stone predecessors could not, enabling architectural innovations that would become hallmarks of Egyptian civilization. The social implications of these technological advances are clearly visible in the burial practices that characterize pre-dynastic Egyptian society. The distribution of copper objects in grave contexts reveals increasingly complex social hierarchies, with elite individuals being interred with assemblages of metal tools, weapons, and ornaments that demonstrated their elevated status. At Nakada, cemetery excavations have revealed graves containing dozens of copper objects alongside pottery, ivory carvings, and imported materials that reflect the deceased's participation in long-distance trade networks. The emergence of regional power centres during this period created competitive dynamics that drove further innovations in metallurgy and military technology. Hierakonpolis, located in Upper Egypt near the First Cataract, developed into a major political and commercial centre whose rulers controlled access to Nubian gold sources and eastern desert copper deposits. The site's impressive archaeological remains include elaborate tombs, monumental architecture, and workshop areas where copper objects were produced on an industrial scale. Competition between Hierakonpolis and other regional centres, particularly Nakada in central Upper Egypt, created demands for superior weapons and military equipment that pushed metallurgical innovation in new directions. Copper mace heads, axes, and spear points from this period show evidence of sophisticated heat treatment techniques that enhanced their hardness and durability. The standardization of weapon designs across different sites suggests that military technology was becoming systematized, possibly through formal training programs or alliance relationships between allied communities. The gradual process of political unification that would culminate in the establishment of the First Pharaonic dynasty around 3100 BC was facilitated by the military advantages that superior copper weapons provided to successful rulers. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Upper Egypt documents episodes of violent conflict during the late pre-dynastic period, with destruction layers containing numerous copper weapons and evidence of defensive preparations. The communities that emerged victorious from these conflicts typically possessed larger quantities of metal weapons and more sophisticated metallurgical capabilities than their defeated rivals. The role of copper weaponry in establishing centralized authority extended beyond simple military superiority to encompass the symbolic and ceremonial functions that metal objects served in Egyptian society. The famous Noma palette commemorating the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt depicts the pharaoh wielding a mace that would have been made from copper or bronze. The ceremonial significance of metal weapons made them essential elements in the regalia of Egyptian rulers, who used them to demonstrate their divine authority and military prowess during public ceremonies. The administrative systems that emerged to manage copper production and distribution created new forms of bureaucratic organization that would become characteristic features of Egyptian civilization. temple complexes served as centres for coordinating mining expeditions, processing raw materials, and distributing finished products according to religious and political priorities. The priests and administrators who managed these activities developed record-keeping systems that tracked production quantities, worker assignments, and distribution schedules with unprecedented precision. The integration of copper production with religious institutions reflected the sacred significance that Egyptians attributed to metallurgical processes. The transformation of raw ore into finished metal objects was understood as a divine act of creation that paralleled the cosmic processes through which the gods had created the world. This religious dimension of metallurgy gave temple authorities enormous influence over technological development and innovation, as they controlled access to both the practical knowledge and the sacred rituals required for successful metal production. The expansion of Egyptian influence during the late pre-dynastic period created new demands for copper objects that could serve diplomatic and commercial functions in addition to their military and ceremonial roles. Egyptian copper tools and weapons appear in archaeological contexts throughout the eastern Mediterranean and Nubia, demonstrating the extent of trade relationships that Egyptian rulers had established. These commercial connections provided access to raw materials, luxury goods, and technological innovations that enhanced Egypt's metallurgical capabilities. The environmental challenges that affected copper production included both the harsh conditions at remote mining sites and the broader climatic changes that influenced agricultural productivity and population distribution. The eastern desert's extreme temperatures, limited water sources, and difficult terrain made mining operations dangerous and expensive, requiring careful planning and substantial resource investment. Climate fluctuations during the late pre-dynastic period affected Nile flood patterns, creating agricultural stresses that influenced the political dynamics of unification. The technological innovations that emerged from Egyptian copperworking included advances in furnace design, bellows systems, and temperature control that would influence metallurgical development throughout the ancient world. Egyptian craftsmen developed techniques for achieving the high temperatures required for bronze production, creating alloys that were superior to pure copper in both hardness and corrosion resistance. These innovations required careful experimentation with fuel types, furnace construction, and airflow management that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of metallurgical principles. The workforce organization required for large-scale copper production created new forms of labor specialization that transformed Egyptian society. Mining expeditions required not only skilled miners and metallurgists, but also support personnel including guards, transport workers, food preparers, and administrative staff. The coordination of these diverse activities required management systems that could allocate resources efficiently while maintaining security and productivity in challenging environments. The influence of copper technology on Egyptian artistic development is evident in the sophisticated decorative objects that appeared during the pre-dynastic period. Copper vessels, ornaments, and ceremonial objects display artistic sophistication that reflects both technical mastery and aesthetic innovation. The malleability of copper allowed craftsmen to create complex forms and surface decorations that would have been impossible with stone or ceramic materials, contributing to the development of distinctive Egyptian artistic traditions. The strategic importance of controlling copper sources influenced Egyptian foreign policy and territorial expansion during the unification period. The establishment of permanent Egyptian presence in the Sinai Peninsula and Eastern Desert required military expeditions, diplomatic negotiations, and administrative systems that could maintain control over distant territories. These territorial acquisitions provided the resource base that would support the monumental construction projects and military campaigns of the early dynastic period. The legacy of pre-dynastic Egyptian copperworking extended far beyond the immediate technological achievements to encompass fundamental innovations in social organization, political administration, and cultural development that would characterize Egyptian civilization for millennia. The administrative systems developed for managing mining operations and metallurgical production provided models for governing complex state institutions, while the military advantages gained through superior copper weapons enabled the political unification that created the world's first unified territorial state. While Egyptian rulers consolidated their control over copper sources in the Eastern Desert and Sinai Peninsula, an equally remarkable but fundamentally different civilization was emerging in the floodplains of the Indus River system. The Harappan civilization, spanning territories across modern-day Pakistan and northwestern India, developed urban planning concepts and metallurgical standardization that surpassed contemporary achievements elsewhere in the ancient world. Unlike the monument-building pharaohs of Egypt or the temple-centered administrators of Mesopotamia, the Harappan people created cities that prioritize functional efficiency, public health, and systematic organization over monumental display. The earliest Harappan settlements emerged around 3300 BC in the fertile alluvial plains, where the Indus River and its tributaries deposited rich sediments during annual floods. At Harappa itself, located in the Punjab region, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of planned urban development that began with the careful selection of elevated ground that could remain habitable during flood seasons, while maintaining access to river transport and agricultural areas. The site's founders constructed massive brick platforms that raised the city's core areas several meters above the surrounding plain, creating a foundation that could support dense urban construction while providing protection from seasonal flooding. The urban planning principles that governed Harappan city construction represented innovations that would not be matched in sophistication until the Roman period. At Mohenjo-Daro, the civilization's largest known city, excavations have revealed a grid-patterned street system with major thoroughfares running north-south and east-west, intersected by smaller lanes that provided access to residential blocks. The main streets measured up to 10 meters in width, sufficient for wheeled traffic and large animal caravans, while maintaining consistent orientations that facilitated navigation and maximized air circulation during the intense summer heat. The residential architecture of Mohenjo-Daro demonstrates the Harappan commitment to standardized construction techniques and public health considerations. Houses typically featured central courtyards surrounded by rooms of varying sizes, with flat roofs that could serve as additional living space during cooler seasons. The buildings were constructed using standardized fired bricks that measured precisely 7 hours, 14 minutes and 28 centimeters in ratio, creating modular construction elements that could be combined in various configurations while maintaining structural integrity. This standardization extended to architectural details, with doorways, windows and wall thicknesses following consistent proportions across different neighborhoods. The most remarkable feature of Harappan urban planning was the sophisticated drainage and sanitation system that served every neighborhood within the major cities. Each house connected to covered drains that ran beneath the streets, carrying wastewater away from residential areas to collection points outside the city walls. The drains themselves were constructed using carefully fitted brick channels with removable stone covers that allowed for cleaning and maintenance. Inspection chambers at regular intervals permitted workers to clear blockages and monitor water flow, while settling tanks removed solid waste before liquid effluent was discharged into agricultural areas. The construction and maintenance of these drainage systems required administrative capabilities that could coordinate activities across entire urban populations. Archaeological evidence suggests that Harappan authorities established standardized procedures for waste disposal, water management, and street cleaning that were enforced throughout their territories. The uniformity of sanitation infrastructure across different Harappan cities indicates that these procedures were systematically implemented, rather than developed independently by each community. The metallurgical workshops that served Harappan cities displayed the same commitment to standardization and quality control that characterized other aspects of their civilization. At Harappa, excavations have uncovered specialized metalworking areas containing furnaces designed for copper smelting, casting installations equipped with standardized molds, and finishing workshops where tools and ornaments received final surface treatments. The workshops were positioned near the city's periphery to minimize fire hazards while remaining integrated with residential and commercial districts through this street network. The copper tools produced in these workshops demonstrate remarkable consistency in design, dimensions, and manufacturing quality. Harappan axes, chisels, knives, and spear points follow standardized patterns that appear with minimal variation at sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. This standardization suggests that Harappan craftsmen worked according to established specifications that were maintained through formal training systems or guild organizations that could ensure consistent quality across different production centers. Chemical analysis of Harappan copper objects reveals sophisticated understanding of alloy composition and its effects on tool performance. The craftsmen regularly produced bronze by adding tin to copper in proportions that optimized hardness and durability for specific applications. Agricultural tools typically contained lower tin percentages that maintain the malleability needed for field repairs, while weapons and cutting implements incorporated higher tin concentrations that enhanced edge retention and impact resistance. This systematic approach to alloy composition demonstrates technical expertise that rivaled contemporary developments in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The raw materials required for Harappan metallurgy came from sources distributed across the Indian subcontinent and beyond, necessitating trade networks that extended from the Hindu Kush mountains to the Deccan Plateau. Copper ores were transported from deposits in Rajasthan and Baluchistan, while tin sources in Afghanistan supplied the materials needed for bronze production. The organization of these supply chains required administrative systems that could coordinate procurement, transportation, and quality control across vast distances and diverse geographical conditions. Archaeological evidence from Shortagai, a Harappan trading post located in northern Afghanistan near lapis lazuli and tin sources, illustrates the extent and sophistication of these commercial networks. The site, positioned strategically along the Amu Darya River, contained warehouses for storing raw materials, workshops for processing ores, and residential areas for permanent trading personnel. The presence of standardized Harappan weights and measures at the site indicates that trade activities followed established procedures that could ensure fair exchanges and quality control. The weight and measurement systems used throughout Harappan territories represent one of the civilization's most remarkable achievements in standardization. Stone cubes found at sites across the Indus Valley follow a consistent binary progression, with weights increasing in ratios of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, creating a mathematical system that could handle transactions of vastly different scales. The smallest weights, measuring less than 1 gram, were suitable for precious materials like gold and gems, while the largest examples could weigh several kilograms for bulk commodity transactions. The precision of these weight standards required manufacturing techniques that could achieve tolerances measured in fractions of grams. Harappan craftsmen created their weights using carefully selected stone materials that were shaped, polished, and tested to ensure accuracy. The consistency of these standards across different sites suggests that weight production was centrally controlled or regulated through systems that could verify accuracy and prevent counterfeiting. This level of standardization implies administrative capabilities that could maintain consistent commercial practices across territories spanning over 1 million square kilometers. The evidence for centralized authority in Harappan society extends beyond weight standards to encompass numerous aspects of urban planning and industrial production. The uniform brick sizes used in construction, the standardized pottery forms found at different sites, and the consistent street widths in different cities all suggest coordinated planning that transcended local community decisions. However, Unlike contemporary civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia, Harappan society appears to have achieved this coordination without the monumental architecture or elaborate burial practices that typically indicate the presence of powerful rulers. The absence of palaces, temples, or royal tombs in Harappan cities has led archaeologists to propose various theories about the nature of political organisation in this civilization. Some scholars suggest that authority was distributed among merchant guilds or craft organisations that could coordinate economic activities without requiring centralised political control. Others propose that religious or ideological systems provided the social cohesion necessary for maintaining consistent practices across different communities. The undeciphered Harappan script remains a crucial obstacle to understanding these political arrangements. The Harappan writing system appears on thousands of seals, pottery vessels, and bronze objects found throughout their territories, but despite decades of scholarly effort, the script remains undeciphered. The symbols, typically arranged in short sequences of 3 to 7 characters, appear to combine pictographic elements with more abstract signs that may represent phonetic values or grammatical markers. The brevity of most inscriptions suggests they may have served administrative functions, possibly recording ownership, quantities, or transaction details related to trade and production activities. The seals themselves provide important insights into Harappan administrative systems and commercial practices. Carved from steatite and fired to create durable surfaces, these seals feature distinctive animal motifs including bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, and mythical creatures that may have identified specific merchants, workshops, or administrative offices. The seals were used to mark clay tags attached to trade goods, creating a system for tracking ownership and authenticity during commercial transactions. The widespread distribution of identical seal designs across different Harappan sites indicates that these marking systems were recognised and accepted throughout their territories. The administrative applications of sealing technology extended to the management of metallurgical production and distribution. Copper ingots found at Harappan sites often bear seal impressions that may have indicated their source, quality grade, or intended destination. This marking system would have enabled administrators to track metal supplies through complex distribution networks while ensuring that materials met established quality standards. The presence of sealed copper objects in residential contexts suggests that metal goods were distributed according to systematic procedures rather than simple market transactions. The scale of copper production in Harappan cities required fuel supplies that placed significant demands on regional forest resources. Archaeological evidence indicates that Harappan metallurgists used wood charcoal for smelting operations, necessitating the transport of timber from distant forested regions to urban workshops. The organisation of these fuel supply chains required administrative capabilities that could coordinate logging operations, transportation networks, and urban distribution systems. The environmental impact of these activities may have contributed to deforestation in areas surrounding major Harappan cities. The technological innovations developed by Harappan craftsmen included advances in furnace design that improved fuel efficiency and temperature control. Excavations at Lothal, a Harappan port city on the Arabian Sea coast, have revealed metallurgical installations with sophisticated air circulation systems that maximised combustion efficiency while minimising fuel consumption. These furnaces incorporated ceramic tuyères that directed airflow precisely where needed, creating the high temperatures required for bronze production while reducing the quantities of charcoal needed for each smelting operation. The port facilities at Lothal demonstrate the maritime dimensions of Harappan trade networks and their integration with metallurgical production. The site features a massive brick-lined dock that could accommodate ocean-going vessels during high tide, while providing protected anchorage during monsoon seasons. Warehouses adjacent to the dock contained copper ingots, finished metal tools, and raw materials that were being prepared for export to trading partners throughout the Arabian Sea region. The discovery of Harappan seals at sites in Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf confirms that these maritime connections extended across vast distances. The agricultural foundations that supported Harappan urban populations included sophisticated irrigation systems that maximised crop yields while managing water resources efficiently. At Dholavira, located in the Kutch region, archaeologists have uncovered elaborate water management installations, including reservoirs, channels and distribution systems that could capture and store monsoon rainfall for use during dry seasons. These systems incorporated copper tools for construction and maintenance activities, demonstrating the integration of metallurgical production with agricultural development. The social organisation required to maintain Harappan cities involved complex relationships between different craft specialists, agricultural producers, and commercial intermediaries. Archaeological evidence suggests that neighbourhoods were organised around specific economic activities, with metalworking areas, pottery production zones, and bead manufacturing districts occupying distinct sectors within larger urban areas. This spatial organisation would have facilitated the coordination of production activities while maintaining the quality control standards that characterised Harappan manufacturing. The evidence for social stratification in Harappan society appears primarily in differential access to luxury goods and superior housing, rather than through monumental architecture or elaborate burial practices. Larger houses with more sophisticated amenities, including private wells and elaborate drainage connections, suggest that some families possessed greater wealth and status than others. However, the absence of extreme disparities in grave goods or residential architecture indicates that Harappan society maintained relatively egalitarian social structures compared to contemporary civilizations elsewhere. The decline of Harappan civilization around 1900 BC remains one of archaeology's most puzzling problems, with various theories proposing climate change, river system alterations, or invasion by external groups as potential explanations. The archaeological evidence shows gradual abandonment of major cities rather than sudden destruction, suggesting that environmental or economic pressures may have made urban life unsustainable. The sophisticated metallurgical traditions and urban planning innovations developed by the Harappans would influence subsequent South Asian civilizations, though their specific achievements would not be matched until much later periods. The copper and bronze objects that represent the final phase of Harappan metallurgy show declining quality and reduced standardization, suggesting that the administrative systems that had maintained consistent production standards were breaking down. This deterioration in metallurgical quality parallels other evidence for social and economic disruption during the civilization's final centuries, when the remarkable achievements in urban planning and technological standardization that had characterized Harappan society for nearly a millennium gradually disappeared from the archaeological record. The sophisticated urban achievements of the Harappan civilization represented one trajectory of Copper Age development, but across the vast expanses of Europe, entirely different patterns were emerging that would fundamentally reshape the continent's cultural and technological landscape. While Harappan cities maintained their remarkable standardization through centralized administrative systems, European communities were experiencing a period of unprecedented mobility and cultural exchange that would distribute copperworking knowledge across distances that dwarfed even the extensive Harappan trade networks. The bell beaker phenomenon, beginning around 2800 BC, represents one of prehistory's most remarkable examples of rapid cultural transmission across vast geographical distances. Within the span of just a few centuries, a distinctive material culture characterized by bell-shaped pottery vessels, copper daggers, stone wrist guards, and standardized ornamental sets appeared simultaneously across territories stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to the British Isles, from the Rhine Valley to the western Mediterranean islands. This cultural package did not spread through gradual diffusion from neighbouring communities, but appeared suddenly at sites separated by thousands of kilometres, suggesting organised migration movements that carried both people and technological knowledge across the European continent. The pottery vessels that gave this culture its archaeological designation were far more than simple containers. These bell-shaped beakers, typically measuring 15-20 centimetres in height, with distinctive inverted profiles and elaborate geometric decorations, required sophisticated ceramic techniques that combined aesthetic refinement with functional efficiency. The decorative patterns, created using comb-like tools before firing, followed standardized motifs that remained remarkably consistent across different regions, while incorporating subtle local variations that suggest individual craftsmen working within established traditions. Chemical analysis of clay sources indicates that these vessels were not trade items manufactured in centralized workshops, but were produced locally by craftsmen who had learned standardized techniques that could be replicated using available materials. The copper objects associated with bell beaker assemblages demonstrate metallurgical capabilities that surpass contemporary European traditions, while maintaining distinctive stylistic characteristics that set them apart from Mediterranean or Near Eastern products. The flat copper daggers found in bell beaker graves typically measured 15 centimetres in length, with tang hafting systems that required precise coordination between metalworkers and handle craftsmen. These weapons were not crude imitations of foreign prototypes, but represented sophisticated understanding of copper's working properties and the mechanical requirements for effective edge weapons. The manufacturing techniques used for bell beaker copper objects required knowledge that extended beyond simple hammering and annealing to encompass casting methods that could produce complex shapes with consistent quality. At sites like Los Millares in southeastern Spain, archaeologists have uncovered workshops containing stone moulds designed for producing standardized dagger forms, along with crucibles and furnace installations that could achieve the temperatures necessary for reliable casting operations. The workshop's organisation suggests that production followed systematic procedures that could maintain quality control while meeting demand from communities across extensive territories. The stone wrist guards that form another characteristic element of bell beaker assemblages served practical functions related to archery, while also functioning as status symbols that identified their wearers' participation in shared cultural traditions. These rectangular stone plaques, typically measuring 12 centimetres in length and perforated with holes for leather fastenings, protected archers' forearms from bowstring impact during shooting. The careful shaping and polishing required for their manufacture, combined with their frequent inclusion in high-status burials, indicates that archery had acquired social significance that extended beyond simple hunting or warfare applications. The rapid spread of bell beaker material culture across Europe coincided with significant changes in settlement patterns and social organisation that suggest fundamental transformations in how communities organise their economic and political relationships. Unlike earlier European cultures that typically maintained stable territorial boundaries over extended periods, bell beaker communities appear to have been highly mobile, establishing new settlements while maintaining connections with distant regions through kinship networks or alliance relationships that could span hundreds of kilometres. Archaeological evidence from sites like Amesbury in southern England demonstrates the international connections that characterised bell beaker society. The famous Amesbury archer, discovered in 2002, was buried around 2300 BC with an assemblage of over 100 objects, including copper daggers, gold ornaments, stone wrist guards, and pottery vessels that reflected influences from across Europe. Isotope analysis of the individual's teeth indicates that he had grown up in the alpine regions of Central Europe before migrating to Britain, where he was buried with grave goods that demonstrated his elevated status within the local community. The presence of the earliest known gold objects in Britain within this burial suggests that bell beaker networks were transmitting not only copper working technology, but also access to precious metals from distant sources. The corded ware culture, which emerged slightly earlier than the bell beaker phenomenon around 2900 BC, played a crucial complementary role in transmitting copper technology across Central and Northern Europe through different mechanisms and social structures. Named for the distinctive cord-impressed decorations on their pottery, corded ware communities established settlements across territories stretching from the Rhine Valley to the Volga River, creating cultural connections that spanned the entire European continent from west to east. The pottery traditions that defined corded ware culture reflected technical innovations that combined functional efficiency with symbolic significance. The characteristic vessels, decorated with patterns created by pressing twisted cords into clay surfaces before firing, required careful timing and technical skill to achieve the sharp, regular impressions that characterize high-quality examples. The standardization of decorative motifs across vast distances suggests that pottery production followed established traditions that were transmitted through formal training systems or maintained through regular contact between distant communities. The copper objects associated with corded ware assemblages demonstrate technological capabilities that developed independently from bell beaker traditions, while achieving comparable levels of sophistication. Corded ware metalworkers specialized in producing shaft-hole axes that required advanced casting techniques for creating the complex internal cavities needed for hafting. These axes, typically weighing 200, 400 grams and measuring 12, 18 centimeters in length, represented significant improvements over earlier European copper tools in terms of both effectiveness and durability. The production of shaft-hole axes required technological innovations that pushed European metallurgy in new directions. The casting process involved creating complex moulds that could form both the external shape and the internal socket needed for handle insertion. Archaeological evidence from workshops in the Carpathian region shows that craftsmen developed sophisticated techniques using clay cores that could be positioned precisely within stone moulds to create the required internal spaces. The consistency of dimensions and proportions across examples found at different sites indicates that production followed standardized specifications that were maintained across extensive territories. The distribution patterns of corded ware copper objects revealed trade networks that connected resource sources with consumption centres through complex exchange relationships. Copper ores from the Slovak ore mountains supplied raw materials for workshops throughout Central Europe, while finished axes and other tools moved in multiple directions according to demand patterns that reflected both practical needs and social preferences. The chemical signatures of copper sources can be traced through spectroscopic analysis, revealing supply chains that extended across political and cultural boundaries while maintaining consistent quality standards. The evidence for cultural exchange between corded ware and bell beaker communities appears in hybrid assemblages that combine elements from both traditions, suggesting that these cultures maintained contact despite their different origins and territorial distributions. At sites along the Rhine Valley, archaeologists have discovered burials containing both cord-decorated pottery and bell-shaped beakers, along with copper objects that incorporate design elements from both traditions. These hybrid assemblages indicate that cultural boundaries were permeable and that technological innovations could cross between different social groups through marriage alliances, trade relationships, or other forms of interaction. The megalithic monuments that appeared across Atlantic Europe during this period demonstrate the organisational capabilities that copper-using communities had developed for coordinating large-scale construction projects. Sites like Stonehenge in England, Carnac in Brittany, and Newgrange in Ireland required the mobilisation of hundreds of workers over extended periods, along with sophisticated planning that could coordinate the transport and positioning of massive stone blocks weighing several tons each. The construction of these monuments coincided with the spread of copper technology, suggesting connections between metallurgical innovation and the social developments that made monumental architecture possible. The relationship between megalithic construction and copper-using communities extends beyond simple chronological correlation to encompass evidence for the specialised tools and organisational systems required for monumental projects. At Stonehenge, archaeological investigations have revealed copper and bronze tools that were used for shaping sarsen stones and creating the precise joints required for the monument's trilithon structures. The tools show evidence of intensive use and frequent resharpening, indicating that metal implements had become essential equipment for stoneworking activities that would have been impossible with earlier technologies. The social organisation required for megalithic construction projects involved complex relationships between different communities that could contribute labour, materials and technical expertise to shared endeavours. Archaeological evidence suggests that monument construction drew participants from territories spanning hundreds of kilometres, with different groups contributing specialised knowledge or resources according to their particular capabilities. The coordination of these multi-community projects required leadership structures that could transcend local political boundaries while maintaining authority over extended construction periods. The astronomical alignments incorporated into many megalithic monuments demonstrate sophisticated understanding of celestial movements that required systematic observation over multiple generations. At Newgrange, the passage tomb's entrance is positioned so that sunlight penetrates the inner chamber only during the winter solstice, creating dramatic lighting effects that transform the monument's interior spaces. The precision required for achieving these alignments suggests that monument builders possessed advanced mathematical and engineering capabilities that complemented their metallurgical expertise. The burial practices associated with megalithic monuments reveal increasingly complex social hierarchies that reflected the wealth and status differences that copper technology was creating within European communities. The passage graves of Brittany contain elaborate assemblages of copper axes, daggers, and ornaments that demonstrate the enormous resources that elite families could accumulate through their control of metallurgical production and long-distance trade. At Barnenair, one of Europe's earliest megalithic complexes, the burial chambers contained copper objects that had been transported from sources hundreds of kilometres away, indicating that monument builders had access to extensive trade networks. The evidence for social stratification in Copper Age European burials extends beyond simple wealth accumulation to encompass the emergence of warrior elites whose status derived from their military capabilities and control over copper weapons. At Remedello in northern Italy, cemetery excavations have revealed graves containing elaborate assemblages of copper daggers, axes and halberds that were clearly designed for combat rather than ceremonial display. The weapons show evidence of use-wear patterns consistent with actual fighting, while their sophisticated metallurgy indicates that warrior groups had access to the finest products of contemporary metalworking technology. The warrior graves of this period often contain standardized sets of weapons and equipment that suggest the emergence of professional military classes with distinctive cultural identities. At Singen in southern Germany, a burial dating to around 2700 BC contained a copper dagger, stone wrist guard, and archery equipment that formed a coherent assemblage designed for mounted or mobile warfare. The grave's occupant had been buried with a complete warrior's kit that would have enabled effective participation in the raiding and territorial conflicts that were becoming increasingly common, as communities competed for control over copper sources and trade routes. The emergence of these warrior elites created new forms of political organisation that differed markedly from the kinship-based systems that had governed earlier European societies. Archaeological evidence suggests that successful warriors could accumulate followers and resources that enabled them to establish territorial control over areas spanning multiple traditional community boundaries. The fortified settlements that appeared across Europe during this period reflect these changing political dynamics, as communities sought protection from increasingly organised military threats, while maintaining access to the trade networks that supplied essential copper tools and weapons. The hill forts that emerged across temperate Europe during the later Copper Age, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture and strategic positioning that reflected the military innovations that copper weapons had made possible. At Maiden Castle in southern England, the earliest defensive earthworks date to around 2500 BC and incorporated multiple lines of ramparts and ditches that could channel attacking forces into killing zones where defenders could maximise the effectiveness of their copper-tipped spears and arrows. The fort's position on elevated ground provided commanding views over surrounding territories while controlling access to important trade routes. The construction of these defensive installations required engineering capabilities that combined military knowledge with sophisticated understanding of earth-moving techniques and structural engineering. The ramparts at sites like Hambledon Hill incorporated timber-reinforced construction that could withstand siege warfare while providing platforms for defenders to coordinate their responses to attacks. The scale of these projects indicates that communities could mobilise substantial labour forces for defensive construction while maintaining their agricultural and craft production activities. The competitive dynamics that drove hill fort construction also stimulated innovations in siege warfare and military technology that pushed metallurgical development in new directions. Copper-tipped arrows became increasingly common in archaeological contexts from this period, while specialised weapons like halberds and battle axes appeared in warrior graves across Europe. These weapons required advanced metallurgical techniques for creating strong, sharp edges that could penetrate defensive armour while maintaining structural integrity during combat. The evidence for organised warfare during the later Copper Age includes not only weapons and fortifications, but also skeletal remains that document the violence that was becoming endemic across much of Europe. At Talheim in Germany, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of 34 individuals who had been killed by systematic violence using stone axes and arrows. The victims included men, women, and children, suggesting that warfare had escalated beyond simple raids between warrior groups to encompass attacks on entire communities. The absence of copper weapons among the perpetrators indicates that access to metal technology could create decisive military advantages that determine the outcomes of these conflicts. The social changes that accompanied the spread of copper technology across Europe created new forms of cultural identity that transcended traditional kinship and territorial boundaries. The standardized material culture assemblages that characterize both bell beaker and corded ware traditions suggest that individuals could maintain connections with distant communities through shared technological knowledge and cultural practices. These connections create new possibilities for social mobility, as skilled craftsmen or successful warriors could establish themselves in distant regions while maintaining their cultural identities through material culture traditions. The technological knowledge that enabled copper working required specialized training and access to closely guarded trade secrets that created new forms of social differentiation within European communities. Master metalworkers achieved status and influence that derived from their technical expertise rather than traditional sources of authority like kinship position or agricultural wealth. The concentration of metallurgical knowledge within specialized craft families created hereditary advantages that could be transmitted across generations, contributing to the social stratification that became increasingly pronounced during the later Copper Age. The technological innovations and social transformations that had swept across European communities during the spread of copper working created new pressures and opportunities in the mountainous regions that separated the expanding cultural zones. The Alpine regions, with their rich copper deposits and strategic position controlling trade routes between northern and southern Europe, became focal points for competition that would generate some of the earliest evidence for organised violence in European prehistory. The discovery of Ötzi the Iceman in 1991, preserved in glacial ice for over 5 millennia, provides an unprecedented window into the violent realities of life during this transformative period. The man who had become known as Ötzi died around 3300 BC on a high alpine pass at an elevation of 3,210 metres, carrying equipment that reveals the sophisticated technological capabilities and complex social relationships that characterised mountain communities during the Copper Age. His copper-bladed axe, the oldest complete example ever discovered, demonstrates metallurgical expertise that combined advanced casting techniques with innovative hafting systems designed for the specific demands of alpine environments. The axe blade, measuring 9.5 centimetres in length and weighing 224 grams, was cast from copper containing trace amounts of arsenic that enhanced its hardness and durability compared to pure copper implements. Chemical analysis of the copper used in Ötzi's axe reveals that the metal originated from ore sources in the Mitterberg region of Austria, approximately 200 kilometres from where his body was discovered. This distance indicates that alpine communities had established trade relationships that could transport finished copper objects across challenging mountain terrain, requiring organised transport systems and established exchange networks that connected different valleys and cultural groups. The axe's sophisticated construction, with its yew-wood handle secured using birch tar adhesive and leather bindings, demonstrates the integration of multiple craft specializations needed to produce effective mountain tools. The circumstances of Ötzi's death provide direct evidence for the violent conflicts that were affecting alpine communities during this period. An arrowhead embedded in his left shoulder, fired from below and behind, indicates that he was fleeing uphill when struck by his pursuer. The wound would have severed major blood vessels, causing rapid blood loss that led to his collapse and death on the mountain pass. The position of the arrow and the trajectory of the shot suggest that his attacker was an experienced archer, familiar with mountain warfare tactics, capable of making accurate shots under difficult conditions while pursuing a fleeing target across rough terrain. The equipment carried by Ötzi reveals preparations for extended travel through dangerous territory, suggesting that mountain journeys during this period required careful planning and defensive capabilities. His unfinished bow, carved from yew-wood but lacking the final shaping needed for use, indicates that he was in the process of replacing damaged equipment, possibly after earlier encounters with hostile groups. The 14 arrows in his quiver, only 2 of which were completed with flint points and feathers, suggest that he had been involved in combat that depleted his ammunition supplies. The sophisticated construction of Ötzi's equipment demonstrates the technological capabilities that alpine communities had developed for surviving in harsh mountain environments, while maintaining the mobility needed for trade and warfare. His leather shoes, stuffed with grass for insulation, were designed for traversing snow and ice, while providing protection against sharp rocks and cold temperatures. The bearskin cap and leather leggings offered protection from wind and precipitation, while his grass cloak provided additional insulation that could be quickly shed if rapid movement became necessary. The copper knife found with Ötzi's body represents another example of alpine metallurgical sophistication, with a blade measuring 6.5 centimetres in length, attached to an ashwood handle using plant fibre bindings. The knife's design reflects the specific requirements of mountain life, where cutting tools needed to serve multiple functions including food preparation, equipment maintenance and emergency defence. The blade shows evidence of frequent resharpening, indicating that it had seen extensive use before Ötzi's final journey. The presence of tattoos on Ötzi's body, created by rubbing charcoal into small incisions, provides evidence for medical practices that alpine communities had developed to treat the injuries and chronic conditions associated with mountain warfare and harsh living conditions. The 61 tattoos, positioned primarily over acupuncture points, corresponding to areas of arthritis and joint stress, suggest that mountain peoples had developed sophisticated understanding of pain management techniques that combined empirical medical knowledge with spiritual or ritual practices. The food remains found in Ötzi's stomach reveal the dietary strategies that enabled alpine communities to maintain themselves in environments where agricultural production was limited and uncertain. His final meal included einkorn wheat, red deer meat, and ibex fat, demonstrating access to both domesticated crops and wild game that required hunting skills adapted to mountain conditions. The presence of hop hornbeam pollen indicates that he had recently travelled through lower elevation forests, suggesting that his final journey involved movement between different ecological zones. The territorial conflicts that led to Ötzi's death were part of broader patterns of violence that affected alpine regions during the transition from the 4th to 3rd millennium BC. Archaeological evidence from fortified settlements throughout the Alps indicates that communities were investing substantial resources in defensive preparations, constructing palisades, earthworks, and stone walls that could protect against organised attacks by rival groups. At Arbonbleich in Switzerland, excavations have revealed a lakeside settlement surrounded by defensive structures that incorporated copper-tipped stakes and other metallurgical innovations designed to maximise defensive effectiveness. The competition for control over alpine copper sources created conflicts that extended beyond simple raids to encompass systematic attempts to dominate resource extraction and distribution networks. The Mitterberg mining complex in Austria, which supplied the copper for Ötzi's axe, shows evidence of intensive exploitation during this period, with mining shafts extending over 100 metres into mountainsides and sophisticated ore processing installations that could handle large quantities of raw materials. The scale of these operations required coordinated labour forces and defensive capabilities that could protect valuable installations from attacks by competing groups. The evidence for organised violence in alpine regions includes not only individual cases like Ötzi, but also mass casualty events that document the escalation of territorial conflicts during this period. At Aspern-Schletz in Austria, archaeologists uncover the remains of over 60 individuals who had been killed during a systematic attack on their fortified settlement around 3300 BC. The victims showed evidence of traumatic injuries inflicted by copper axes, arrows, and blunt force weapons. While the absence of valuable objects from the site suggests that the attack was motivated by territorial conquest rather than simple raiding, the weapons technology that enabled these conflicts included innovations that adapted copper working techniques to the specific requirements of mountain warfare. Alpine copper axes typically featured longer handles and heavier heads than their lowland counterparts, providing the leverage needed for effective combat in rocky terrain where traditional weapons might be damaged by impact with stone surfaces. The hafting systems used for these weapons incorporated multiple binding techniques that could maintain integrity under the stress conditions of mountain combat. The development of specialized mountain warfare tactics is evident in the design of fortified positions that took advantage of alpine topography to maximize defensive advantages. At Stillfried in Austria, a hilltop settlement dating to this period incorporated multiple defensive lines that channeled attackers through narrow passages where defenders could concentrate their fire using copper-tipped arrows and spears. The positioning of these defences demonstrates sophisticated understanding of military engineering principles adapted to mountain conditions. The social organisation required for maintaining defensive installations and organising military expeditions in alpine environments created new forms of leadership that differed from the kinship-based systems that had governed earlier mountain communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that successful war leaders could accumulate followers and resources that enabled them to establish territorial control over entire valley systems, creating the first examples of centralized political authority in alpine regions. The long-distance trade relationships that supplied alpine communities with essential resources created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile groups seeking to disrupt enemy supply lines. The high-altitude passes that provided the only practical routes for transporting goods between valleys became strategic choke points where small forces could intercept much larger trading expeditions. The isolated location where Ötzi died suggests that he may have been attempting to use a little-known route to avoid such interception attempts. The equipment carried by Ötzi includes items that demonstrate the international connections maintained by alpine communities despite the violent conditions that characterized the region. His copper axe blade contains trace elements that suggest knowledge of alloying techniques developed in distant regions, while the flint used for his arrowheads originated from sources in northern Italy, indicating that trade networks continued to function despite ongoing territorial conflicts. The preservation conditions that maintained Ötzi's body and equipment for over 5 millennia have provided archaeologists with unprecedented insights into the material culture and technological capabilities of Copper Age alpine communities. The organic materials that rarely survive in normal archaeological contexts, including leather, wood, grass, and plant fibers, reveal the sophisticated understanding of natural resources that enabled mountain peoples to create effective equipment using locally available materials. The birch fungus carried by Ötzi, known for its medicinal properties, indicates that alpine communities had developed pharmaceutical knowledge that could treat the infections and digestive problems that were common in mountain environments where sanitation was difficult to maintain. The presence of these materials suggests that mountain travellers carried medical supplies that could address common health problems during extended journeys through dangerous territory. The evidence for territorial boundaries in alpine regions during this period comes from the distribution patterns of distinctive artifact styles and the positioning of fortified settlements that controlled access to specific valleys or resource areas. The copper objects found at different sites show regional variations in design and manufacturing techniques that suggest the existence of distinct cultural territories, while the locations of defensive installations indicate systematic attempts to control movement through strategic mountain passes. The impact of climate fluctuations on alpine communities during this period created additional pressures that intensified competition for the limited agricultural areas that could support permanent settlements. Paleoclimatic evidence indicates that temperatures were beginning to decline from the warmer conditions that had characterized earlier periods, reducing the elevation limits for agriculture and forcing communities to compete for access to the most productive valley floors. These environmental pressures contributed to the territorial conflicts that made mountain travel increasingly dangerous. The technological innovations that emerged from alpine warfare included improvements in archery equipment that enhanced accuracy and range under mountain conditions. The composite bow technology that was developing during this period allowed archers to achieve greater power and precision than was possible with simple wooden bows, while specialized arrowhead designs optimized penetration against leather armor and wooden shields. These innovations would later spread to lowland regions through the trade networks that connected alpine communities with broader European cultural developments. The evidence for systematic violence in alpine regions during Ötzi's lifetime indicates that copper technology had transformed mountain warfare from sporadic raiding to organized territorial conquest. The weapons and fortifications that characterize this period demonstrate sophisticated understanding of military engineering and tactical planning that enabled small mountain communities to project power across extensive territories while defending their own strategic positions against increasingly well-organized enemies. The violent mountain conflicts that claimed Ötzi's life represented only one facet of the broader transformations reshaping European society during the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BC. While alpine communities struggled for control over strategic passes and copper sources, the Iberian Peninsula was witnessing the emergence of some of Europe's most sophisticated prehistoric settlements, characterized by architectural innovations and metallurgical achievements that would establish new standards for defensive construction and technological development across the western Mediterranean. The Los Milers culture, centred in the arid landscapes of southeastern Spain, developed between approximately 3200 and 2200 BC into one of Europe's most complex prehistoric societies. The eponymous site of Los Milers, situated on a triangular plateau overlooking the Andarax River Valley, demonstrates urban planning concepts that surpassed contemporary European achievements while incorporating defensive innovations that would influence fortification design throughout the Mediterranean world. The settlement's builders constructed massive stone walls that enclosed an area of nearly 5 hectares, incorporating 13 semicircular bastions that projected outward from the main defensive line to provide overlapping fields of fire against potential attackers. The construction techniques employed at Los Milers reveal sophisticated understanding of military engineering principles adapted to local geological conditions and available materials. The defensive walls, reaching heights of up to 4 meters and widths of 3 meters at their base, were built using carefully selected limestone blocks that were shaped and fitted without mortar, creating structures that could withstand both siege weapons and seismic activity common in the region. The bastions incorporated internal chambers that could store weapons and supplies while providing protected positions for defenders to coordinate their responses to attacks from multiple directions. Archaeological excavations within the Los Milers settlement have revealed a complex urban layout that integrated residential areas, craft workshops, and storage facilities within the defensive perimeter. The houses, constructed using stone foundations supporting mud brick walls, followed standardized plans that maximize space efficiency while maintaining structural integrity under the stress conditions created by the region's frequent earthquakes. The largest structures, positioned near the settlement's center, contained multiple rooms with specialized functions, including copper working areas, pottery kilns, and storage chambers that could accommodate the surplus production that supported the community's specialized craftsmen. The metallurgical workshops at Los Milers produced copper objects that demonstrate technical capabilities rivaling contemporary achievements in the eastern Mediterranean, while developing distinctive regional characteristics that reflect local innovations and preferences. The site's metalworkers created sophisticated casting installations that could produce complex objects including flat axes, tanged daggers, and ornamental items that required precise temperature control and advanced understanding of metal flow properties. Chemical analysis of copper artifacts from the site indicates that craftsmen were working with ores from multiple sources, including local deposits in the Sierra Nevada and imported materials from more distant regions. The copper mining operations that supplied Los Milers and related settlements transformed the economic landscape of southeastern Iberia through the establishment of specialized mining communities that developed innovative extraction techniques adapted to local geological conditions. At Cerro Virtud, located approximately 15 kilometers from Los Milers, archaeologists have uncovered extensive mining installations featuring vertical shafts that extend over 20 meters below ground level, connected by horizontal galleries that followed ore veins through the surrounding rock formations. The mining operations incorporated sophisticated ventilation systems that maintained air circulation in deep workings, while removing dangerous gases that could accumulate in confined spaces. The organisation of these mining operations required administrative capabilities that could coordinate activities across multiple sites, while maintaining quality control standards that ensured consistent ore grades and processing efficiency. Archaeological evidence indicates that mining communities established permanent settlements near major extraction sites, complete with residential areas, workshops for tool production and maintenance, and storage facilities for processed ores awaiting transport to manufacturing centres. The presence of standardised copper ingots at these sites suggests that mining operations followed established procedures for ore processing and quality assessment that enabled systematic distribution to different workshops and trading partners. The technological innovations developed by Iberian miners included improvements in shaft construction techniques that enabled deeper excavation while maintaining structural stability in challenging geological conditions. The timber support systems found in Los Milars period mines incorporate sophisticated joinery techniques that distributed structural loads effectively while allowing for the expansion and contraction that occurred as wood aged and dried. These support systems required coordinated efforts between miners, carpenters, and engineers who could assess geological conditions and design appropriate structural solutions for specific excavation challenges. The evidence for specialized mining communities extends beyond simple extraction activities to encompass the development of distinct cultural identities that reflected the unique social and economic conditions created by intensive resource exploitation. Cemetery excavations near major mining sites have revealed burial practices that differed markedly from contemporary agricultural communities, with grave goods emphasizing copper tools, mining equipment, and ornamental objects that demonstrated the deceased's participation in metallurgical activities. The presence of copper objects in children's graves suggests that mining expertise was transmitted through family lineages that maintained control over specific technical knowledge and resource access rights. The warrior elites that emerged within Los Milars society developed military capabilities that reflected both the wealth generated by copper production and the defensive requirements created by competition for control over mining territories and trade routes. Elite burials from the site contain elaborate assemblages of copper weapons, including daggers with ivory handles, ceremonial axes with decorative elements, and archery equipment that demonstrates the integration of metallurgical innovation with military technology. The weapons show evidence of actual combat use alongside their ceremonial functions, indicating that Los Milars elites were active participants in the territorial conflicts that characterized the period. The fortification systems that protected Los Milars and related settlements incorporated defensive innovations that responded to evolving military technologies and tactical approaches developed by competing groups throughout the region. The outer defensive line, located approximately 650 meters from the main settlement, consisted of a series of small circular forts positioned to control access routes, while providing early warning of approaching enemies. These outposts connected to the main settlement through a sophisticated communication system using signal fires and horn calls, enabled defenders to coordinate their responses to attacks while maintaining control over the surrounding agricultural areas that supplied the community's food requirements. The architectural techniques employed in Los Milars fortifications demonstrate knowledge of defensive engineering principles that had been developed through practical experience with siege warfare and assault tactics. The bastions incorporated features that maximized the effectiveness of copper-tipped arrows and spears while minimizing the exposure of defenders to enemy fire. The internal layout of defensive positions included protected storage areas for weapons and ammunition, while communication passages allowed rapid movement of personnel between different sections of the fortification system during combat situations. The evidence for organized violence in Los Milars society includes not only fortifications and weapons, but also skeletal remains that document the injuries and trauma associated with systematic warfare. Burials from the site contain individuals with healed fractures, embedded arrowheads, and other injuries consistent with participation in organized combat, while mass graves suggest episodes of intensive conflict that resulted in significant casualties. The distribution of these injuries across different age groups and social classes indicates that warfare affected entire communities rather than being limited to specialized warrior groups. The trade networks that connected Los Milars with communities throughout the Western Mediterranean created commercial relationships that extended far beyond simple resource exchange to encompass cultural transmission and technological diffusion across vast distances. Archaeological evidence indicates that Los Milars merchants maintained regular contact with communities in North Africa, establishing trading posts and commercial relationships that facilitated the exchange of copper objects, ivory, ostrich eggshells, and other luxury materials that enhanced the status and wealth of Iberian elites. The North African connections maintained by Los Mileras communities are documented through the presence of African materials in Iberian archaeological contexts and the appearance of Iberian-style objects at sites along the Mediterranean coast of Africa. At Taforalt in Morocco, excavations have revealed copper objects that display manufacturing techniques and stylistic characteristics consistent with Iberian production, while ivory objects found at Los Mileras show carving techniques that reflect African artistic traditions. These exchanges required organised trading expeditions that could navigate the challenging waters of the Strait of Gibraltar while maintaining commercial relationships across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The maritime capabilities that enabled these long-distance trading relationships included innovations in boat construction and navigation techniques that allowed Iberian communities to undertake regular voyages across open water to destinations hundreds of kilometres from their home territories. Archaeological evidence for these maritime activities comes from coastal settlements that feature harbour installations, boat-building workshops, and storage facilities designed for handling seaborne cargoes. The presence of standardized weights and measures at these sites indicates that maritime trade followed established procedures that could ensure fair exchanges and quality control across different cultural contexts. The development of these maritime trading networks required technological innovations that extended beyond simple boat construction to encompass navigation techniques, cargo handling systems, and diplomatic protocols that could facilitate commercial relationships with distant communities. The boats used for Mediterranean trade during this period, reconstructed from fragmentary archaeological remains and ethnographic parallels, typically measured 15 metres in length and featured shallow drafts that enabled navigation in both open waters and coastal shallows where trading activities often took place. The social complexity that characterized Los Mileras society is evident in the elaborate burial practices that developed during the culture's florescence, reflecting increasing social stratification and the concentration of wealth and power within elite lineages. The famous collective tombs, constructed using massive stone slabs arranged in circular chambers covered by earthen mounds, contained hundreds of individuals buried with grave goods that demonstrate the enormous resources that successful families could accumulate through their control of metallurgical production and long-distance trade. The Tholos tombs that represent the most sophisticated examples of Los Mileras mortuary architecture required engineering capabilities that combined architectural knowledge with sophisticated understanding of structural mechanics and geological conditions. The largest examples, measuring up to 5 metres in internal diameter with corbelled stone roofs that could support substantial earthen superstructures, incorporated drainage systems and ventilation features that maintained appropriate conditions for repeated use over extended periods. The construction of these monuments required coordinated labour efforts, involving skilled stonemasons, engineers, and workers who could transport and position massive stone blocks weighing several tons each. The grave goods found within these collective tombs reveal the international connections and sophisticated material culture that characterized Los Mileras elites during the height of their cultural development. Copper objects include not only locally produced items, but also imports that demonstrate contact with communities throughout the Mediterranean basin, while ivory carvings, gold ornaments, and exotic stone materials indicate access to luxury goods from Africa and other distant regions. The presence of specialized tools including copper saws, chisels, and drilling equipment suggests that tomb construction and maintenance required technical expertise that was concentrated within specific craft lineages. The religious and ceremonial significance of these burial monuments extended beyond simple mortuary functions to encompass community-wide rituals that reinforce social hierarchies while maintaining cultural traditions across multiple generations. Archaeological evidence indicates that the tombs were reopened periodically for additional burials and ritual activities that involved the manipulation of ancestral remains and the deposition of new grave goods. These practices created connections between living communities and their ancestors, while demonstrating the continuity of elite lineages that maintained control over essential resources and technical knowledge. The agricultural foundations that supported Los Millares society included innovations in farming techniques and crop varieties that maximised productivity in the challenging environmental conditions of southeastern Iberia. The region's arid climate and irregular precipitation patterns required irrigation systems and water management techniques that could capture and distribute the limited available moisture while preventing soil salinization and erosion. Archaeological evidence indicates that Los Millares communities developed sophisticated understanding of soil management, crop rotation, and selective breeding that enabled them to achieve agricultural surpluses sufficient to support their specialized craftsmen and trading activities. The environmental challenges that affected Los Millares communities included not only the natural limitations imposed by climate and topography, but also the human-induced changes that resulted from intensive mining operations and deforestation associated with copper smelting activities. The fuel requirements for metallurgical production placed enormous demands on regional forest resources, necessitating the transport of wood and charcoal from increasingly distant sources as local supplies became depleted. These environmental pressures contributed to the competitive dynamics that characterized relationships between different communities, while creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies seeking to disrupt essential resource supplies. The decline of Los Millares culture around 2200 BC coincided with broader changes affecting communities throughout the Western Mediterranean, including climate fluctuations that reduced agricultural productivity and intensified competition for control over the most productive territories. Archaeological evidence indicates that many Los Millares settlements were abandoned during this period, with populations either dispersing to smaller communities or migrating to regions that offered better opportunities for agricultural and metallurgical activities. The sophisticated fortification systems and urban planning innovations that had characterized the culture's florescence were not maintained by successor communities, suggesting that the social and economic systems that had supported these achievements had collapsed or been fundamentally transformed. The technological legacy of Los Millares culture extended far beyond the immediate region to influence metallurgical development and defensive architecture throughout Atlantic Europe and the Western Mediterranean. The innovations in copperworking, fortification design, and urban planning that characterized the culture provided models that would be adapted and modified by subsequent communities as they developed their own responses to the challenges and opportunities created by expanding trade networks and intensifying territorial competition. The sophisticated achievements of Los Millares culture represented the culmination of over 2 millennia of copperworking innovation across Europe and the Mediterranean. But by 2200 BC, the environmental and social pressures that had driven these developments were creating conditions that would fundamentally transform metallurgical technology and reshape ancient societies. The discovery of tin-bronze alloys, which had been developing gradually through experimental additions of various metals to copper, was reaching a critical threshold where the superior properties of bronze would begin to revolutionize both military technology and everyday tool production across the ancient world. The earliest systematic production of tin bronze appears in the archaeological record around 2500 BC at sites scattered across Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean, where metalworkers had been experimenting with various additives to copper for centuries. Unlike the arsenic-copper alloys that had dominated earlier periods, tin bronze offered consistent properties that could be reliably reproduced, provided craftsmen had access to tin sources and understood the precise ratios needed for optimal performance. At Kultepe in central Anatolia, workshops dating to this period contained crucibles with residues showing tin concentrations of 8–12%, the optimal range for producing bronze that combined maximum hardness with workability for complex casting operations. The technical advantages of tin bronze over pure copper were immediately apparent to craftsmen who gained access to the new technology. Bronze tools maintained sharper edges for extended periods, resisted corrosion more effectively than copper, and could be cast into more complex shapes without the brittleness problems that had limited earlier alloy experiments. At Troy II, dating to approximately 2400 BC, archaeologists have uncovered bronze weapons that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of alloy composition, with different tin percentages optimized for specific applications. Sword blades contained higher tin concentrations for maximum hardness, while handles and decorative elements used lower percentages that maintained the malleability needed for detailed finishing work. The procurement of tin presented challenges that would reshape trade networks across the ancient world, as tin deposits were far less common than copper sources and often located in regions that were difficult to access or politically unstable. The primary tin sources available to ancient metalworkers included deposits in Cornwall, Bohemia, and Central Asia, requiring trade relationships that spanned thousands of kilometers and crossed multiple cultural and political boundaries. At Ugarit on the Syrian coast, tablets dating to around 2000 BC document tin shipments arriving from distant sources, with merchants paying premium prices for materials that were essential for bronze production, but available only through complex international trade networks. The transformation of existing copper working centres to accommodate bronze production required significant investments in new equipment and technical training that many communities struggled to afford during a period of increasing environmental stress and political instability. The higher temperatures needed for reliable bronze casting demanded improved furnace designs and more sophisticated bellows systems, while the precise control required for optimal alloy composition necessitated standardized measurement techniques and quality control procedures that exceeded the capabilities of many traditional workshops. At Mycenae in Greece, the transition to bronze production is documented through successive workshop levels that show gradual improvements in furnace construction and the appearance of standardized ingot forms that facilitated consistent alloy production. The social implications of bronze technology extended far beyond simple improvements in tool quality to encompass fundamental changes in military organization and political power structures throughout the ancient world. Bronze weapons provided decisive advantages in combat situations, as bronze swords could penetrate leather armor that had been effective against copper weapons, while bronze-tipped arrows achieved greater range and accuracy than their copper predecessors. The communities that gained early access to bronze technology could establish military dominance over their neighbours, creating incentives for territorial expansion and political consolidation that would characterize the early Bronze Age across multiple regions. The evidence for this military transformation appears in destruction layers at numerous Copper Age sites throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, where archaeological contexts dating to around 2200 to 2000 BC contain bronze weapons, alongside evidence of violent conflict and settlement abandonment. At Lerna in Greece, the famous House of the Tiles was destroyed around 2200 BC in a conflagration that left bronze arrowheads embedded in the building's walls, while similar destruction episodes at sites throughout the Aegean suggest coordinated military campaigns that exploited the advantages provided by superior bronze weaponry. The population movements that accompanied these technological and military changes included both voluntary migration seeking access to tin sources and trade routes, and involuntary displacements caused by military conquests and environmental pressures that made traditional territories unsustainable. The Belgica culture, which had spread copper working technology across Atlantic Europe during the previous centuries, began to fragment around 2300 BC as communities adapted to changing conditions through different strategies. Some groups intensified their participation in long-distance trade networks to maintain access to tin supplies, while others developed local alternatives or reverted to simpler technologies that could be sustained using available resources. The Indo-European language dispersals that many linguists associate with this period may have been facilitated by the military advantages that bronze technology provided to expanding populations. Archaeological evidence suggests that groups possessing bronze weapons and horse-drawn vehicles could project military power across vast distances, establishing political control over territories that had previously been defended successfully by copper-using communities. At Sintashta in the Ural steppes, fortified settlements dating to around 2100 BC contained bronze weapons, horse burials, and spoke-wheeled chariots that represent some of the earliest evidence for the military innovations that would characterize Indo-European expansion across Eurasia. The horse domestication that reached full development during this transition period created new possibilities for both military organization and long-distance trade that would prove crucial for maintaining the supply networks needed for bronze production. Unlike cattle or sheep, horses could carry riders across vast distances while maintaining speeds that enabled rapid communication and coordination between distant communities. At Botai in Kazakhstan, archaeological evidence dating to around 2200 BC includes horse pits, corrals, and processing areas that document the systematic exploitation of horses for transportation, military applications, and food production. The combination of bronze weapons and horse-mounted warfare created military capabilities that enabled small, well-equipped forces to dominate much larger populations that lacked access to these technologies. The archaeological evidence for this transformation includes the appearance of warrior graves throughout Europe and Western Asia that contain standardized assemblages of bronze weapons, horse equipment, and prestige objects that reflect the emergence of professional military elites. At Amesbury in England, elite burials dating to around 2000 BC contained bronze daggers, gold ornaments, and archers' equipment that demonstrate the international connections maintained by successful warriors during this period of technological transition. The urban centres that had flourished during the Copper Age faced particular challenges during the transition to bronze technology, as their economic foundations were disrupted by changing trade patterns and military threats that traditional defensive systems could not address effectively. Many of the fortified settlements that had dominated regional landscapes during the previous millennium were abandoned around 2200 to 2000 BC, with populations dispersing to smaller communities that could adapt more readily to changing conditions. The Cucuteni Tripilia mega-settlements of Eastern Europe, which had supported populations numbering in the tens of thousands, disappeared completely during this period, leaving only archaeological traces of their former grandeur. The environmental factors that contributed to these social transformations included climate deterioration that reduced agricultural productivity across much of Europe and Western Asia, creating food shortages that intensified competition for the most productive territories. The 4.2 kiloyear event, documented in paleoclimatic records from ice cores and lake sediments, brought cooler temperatures and reduced precipitation that stressed agricultural systems that had been adapted to the warmer conditions of the previous millennium. These environmental pressures created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by groups possessing superior military technology, while forcing traditional communities to develop new survival strategies that often involved abandoning established settlements and territorial boundaries. The collapse of traditional political systems during this transition period created opportunities for innovative forms of social organization that would characterize early Bronze Age societies. The palace-centered bureaucracies that would emerge in Mycenaean Greece and other Bronze Age civilizations represented new approaches to managing the complex supply chains and military organizations needed for bronze production and territorial control. These administrative systems incorporated innovations in record-keeping, resource management, and diplomatic relations that enabled centralized authorities to coordinate activities across extensive territories while maintaining the international relationships needed for accessing essential raw materials. The technological innovations that emerged during this transition period extended beyond metallurgy to encompass advances in transportation, communication, and military organization that would define Bronze Age civilization for the next millennium. The development of spoke-wheeled vehicles enabled more efficient transport of heavy materials over long distances, while improvements in shipbuilding technology facilitated maritime trade relationships that connected distant regions through regular commercial exchanges. At Uluburun off the Turkish coast, a shipwreck dating to around 1300 BC contained tin ingots, copper oxhide ingots, and finished bronze objects that document the international scope of Bronze Age trade networks. The craft specialization that had developed during the Copper Age reached new levels of sophistication, as bronze production required coordination between different specialists including miners, smelters, casters, and finishers who each possessed essential technical knowledge. The training systems needed to transmit this knowledge created new forms of social organization based on craft guilds and workshop hierarchies that transcended traditional kinship relationships. At Knossos in Crete, Linear B tablets document the complex administrative systems that palace authorities used to manage bronze production, including detailed records of raw material allocations, worker assignments, and finished product distributions. The religious and ceremonial significance of bronze objects reflected their superior properties and the complex social relationships involved in their production and distribution. Bronze Age societies developed elaborate ritual practices centered on metalworking activities, with smiths achieving semi-divine status as masters of transformative technologies that could convert raw ores into finished objects of extraordinary beauty and functionality. The ceremonial axes, swords, and ornaments found in Bronze Age hoards throughout Europe demonstrate the sacred significance that these societies attributed to bronze objects, which served as offerings to deities, symbols of political authority, and repositories of accumulated wealth. The legacy of Copper Age innovations in social organization, trade networks, and technological development provided essential foundations for Bronze Age civilizations that would dominate the ancient world for the next 1,000 years. The administrative systems developed for managing copper production and long-distance trade created models for the palace bureaucracies that would coordinate Bronze Age economies, while the military technologies and organizational structures that had emerged during the Copper Age transition provided templates for the professional armies that would characterize Bronze Age warfare. The urban planning concepts pioneered by Harappan civilization, the defensive architecture innovations of Los Millares culture, and the metallurgical expertise developed across Europe and the Mediterranean during the Copper Age all contributed to the technological and social foundations that enabled Bronze Age societies to achieve unprecedented levels of complexity and territorial control. The trade networks that had connected copper-producing regions with manufacturing centres and consumer markets evolved into the international commercial systems that would facilitate Bronze Age prosperity, while creating the diplomatic relationships and cultural exchanges that would characterize ancient Mediterranean civilization. The transformation from copper to bronze technology marked more than a simple improvement in metallurgical capabilities. It represented a fundamental shift in how human societies organized themselves for production, warfare, and territorial control. The Copper Age had introduced humanity to the possibilities and challenges of metal technology, while creating the social structures and international relationships that would prove essential for managing the more complex requirements of Bronze Age civilization. The innovations in mining, smelting, casting and alloying that had developed over 2 millennia of copperworking provided the technical foundation for bronze production, while the trade networks, administrative systems and military organisations that had emerged during the Copper Age created the institutional framework that would enable Bronze Age societies to exploit the full potential of their superior metallurgical capabilities. As the 3rd millennium BC drew to a close, the ancient world stood transformed by the revolutionary changes that copper technology had initiated. The small-scale farming communities that had first experimented with native copper nuggets had evolved into complex societies capable of coordinating activities across vast territories, while maintaining the international relationships needed for accessing essential resources and markets. The legacy of these Copper Age innovations would influence human development for millennia to come, establishing patterns of technological innovation, social organisation, and international cooperation that would shape the course of ancient history and provide enduring models for human achievement in the face of environmental challenges and competitive pressures